just smash it to pieces. Well, not to pieces, but hard enough to make sure that it works.
Okay, this is take 2. Once again, okay, sorry for any hiccups, guys. Once again, this is Prehistory Traveler's Guide. Host Greg Nyman speaking here. Oh, and on host duty tonight, we have newcomer A.K. Rex, returning guest hosts Mike Fredericks, Prehistoric Times, Geek Island's Sean Markey, and my usual team of hosts, cryptozoologist Scott Martis, vlogger Chris Grawl, and fellow dino enthusiast Samuel Eiler. And as our guest of honor tonight, we are bringing from the University of Carthage, Wisconsin, Dr. Thomas Carr, another one of the big 3 in tyrannosaur experts. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Carr.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yep, you're welcome. If this goes without a hitch. Well, anyhow, if you would like to go over again what got you interested in dinosaurs and theropods, maybe discuss a little bit about your early life, how your education, who your teachers were, and so forth, and maybe to close it out, maybe some tips on anyone who's looking to maybe follow in the same path that you did.
Sure. Well, my interest in dinosaurs started when I was 2 with the little, I think, Gold Key or Golden Guide on Dinosaurs, a little tiny book, and I was captivated by T-Rex ever since then, and my decision to study tyrannosaurs came in 1988 with the publication of the Nanotyrannus article, the infamous Nanotyrannus article. Up a few years before that, I had a very healthy interest in dromaeosaurids and tyrannosaurs, and one day in my living room, when I was about 18 years old, I was looking at Ostrom's monograph on Deinonychus and the Nanotyrannus article, and I realized that tyrannosaurs really had a very good sample size, and that's good for science, is to have a big sample of fossils. And at that time, dromaeosaurids just weren't that well known. The fossil record wasn't anywhere near what it is today. And so it was a very easy decision to make. And at the same time, I was revisiting that original passion. Since that time, I've got an undergraduate degree, a master's, Master of Science, and also a PhD. And tips for students who want to become paleontologists: I really recommend that they focus on math and science when they're in high school or middle school, and then pursue a Bachelor of Science degree at a college or university, and then continue from there into a master's or perhaps even a PhD directly. My bias is biology, so I usually recommend to students that they pursue biology as their primary degree or major while in college, because paleontology really does need evolutionary biologists. Vertebrate paleontology and the entire field of paleontology, for that matter, is a subset of biology. And so we need people with an evolutionary bent studying those organisms so that we can really understand the history of life on this planet.
I couldn't agree more of your sentiments, Dr. Carr, and I'm sure most of my panelists will definitely agree with me on that.
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Carr, do you still have your little golden book of dinosaurs by any chance?
Yes, I do.
Okay, I was going to say I've got about 10 copies, and I'd be honored to send you one, but I guess you already have it.
Yes, I do. I did not let that go.
No, that had a big effect on me as a kid, too, I'll tell you.
Yeah, I think that's another important aspect is for students and dinosaur fans alike is to hold on to books, to really build up those libraries, even from our earliest days. Because even a book like that becomes a historical document in its own right.
I actually have to agree with that, Dr. Carr. One of my great follies in life was that I gave away all of my dinosaur books that I had as a child to cousins and relatives, and I'd say I've probably spent an absolute fortune trying to get them all back on eBay now. So,
yeah.
Of course.
eBay.
Yeah, I'm guilty of the same thing. I've only got like a few of them left, and a lot of them are in the Russian language because I grew up in south of Russia, and we had so many awesome like books that are just so valuable now as a collectible pieces. We even had like one that was printed in the form of like a soft kind of cover, but it looks like a book, but it was not quite a book. It was like a magazine, but not quite a magazine either. So it was something really weird and a thing of its own, and I don't have it anymore. And I'm like just hitting myself in the wall, with my head in the wall all the time, every day, thinking, how could I lose that? It's just crazy. But it was one of those things I agree with. I mean, I should have really held on to my collection.
There's a book that I gave up that I really regret doing now called The Graveyard of the Dinosaurs, I think it was, by Shelley Tanaka. I love that book so much. I really regret giving that up now.
One that I grew up with is The How and Why Wonder Book of Dinosaurs.
Oh, yeah.
That was a great one.
Yeah, that was part of the canon for me, too.
Anybody here also, I presume many of us are probably similar age groups, so we would have probably encountered a lot of the same pieces anyway. But you probably know of the name Dougal Dixon, and obviously like the paleo art, featured in these books as well. Like
Yes.
that stuff. Everybody knows that. So yeah, I had quite a lot of them. That lot was quite popular where I grew up. Like every time we went out, of school to go to like the book markets, there was like a street book market of sort, like a book fair, and they would sell all of this stuff, and I would just like go in there wanting to buy everything, but obviously I didn't have enough money because back in the days we'd always be given a little bit, so I could maybe like buy one piece per week, and I would always make the tough choice to make sure that I get this one, to make sure they never run out, so they would have something next week, to come back to. So exciting stuff. Good times.
Now, he's big on evolution, too, Douglas. You know who I like, too, is Roy Chapman Andrews' book on going to Mongolia and everything. He was like the Harrison Ford character before there was him,
Yep.
Yeah.
That leads me to a good question here, Dr. Carr. Who were your inspirations for wanting to get into paleontology while you were growing up?
Well, at the start, it was the dinosaurs themselves, and it took me a while to really be aware of the idea that our knowledge of dinosaurs actually comes from people. And I guess my earliest inspirations would have been people like Dale Russell, who wrote Dinosaurs: An Odyssey in Time. That was a book that I carried with me quite frequently. I grew up in Canada, so Philip Currie was also somebody who stood out, who was known as a dinosaur paleontologist back in the 80s. And I also had the good fortune of meeting informally paleontologists like Chris McGowan and Gordon Edmond, who worked down at the Royal Ontario Museum. So I'd say that they were my, in the early days, sort of my main inspirations and main connection to the scientists and to the human part of the science.
Well, Gowan's an ichthyosaur expert.
Yes, Chris is one of the world experts on ichthyosaurs, and he was also my PhD advisor, which was a lot of fun.
Do you know Ryosuke Motani?
Yes, I do. Ryosuke and I overlapped when he was postdocing at the ROM, and we also overlapped when he was Chris's student.
Great.
Okay, here I'll let Sam field one of his first questions from Facebook.
One of my first questions is, what are your views on Jack Horner's theory about Tyrannosaurus being more of a scavenger than a hunter?
I think it's an interesting hypothesis, and it's important because it forces us to re-examine our assumptions about the ecology and habits and functional morphology of extinct animals, T-Rex in particular in this case. So I think that the hypothesis is important for taking a second look at all the evidence that we take for granted as evidence of predation. But I do have to say that at the end of the day, for me, I'm very tree-based, so I pay close attention to evolutionary relationships of organisms, and in particular tyrannosaurs, of course. And so it seems clear that tyrannosaurs were ancestrally predatory and that they didn't lose that. And I don't think T-Rex would have been any different. So I do think, T-Rex, if you're going to force me into a corner, I think based on just relationships alone, it's reasonable to consider T-Rex as a hunter. Certainly we know predatory animals will not pass up a free meal, so something dead. But there's also something cool about T-Rex, and that is that it is really different from other tyrannosaurs. Its size is the obvious one, but its overall bulk, in contrast to other large tyrannosaurs, is quite astounding. I've been working on Daspletosaurus a lot recently, and I'm always amazed when I open up a drawer and see the same bone of T-Rex. T-Rex just outsizes everything. It's truly in its own realm, but I think that those differences are, do not point in the direction of not being a hunter. It's just T-Rex is in its own size class, and that's largely what makes it different. But I don't think its habits were any different from others.
Very much for answering that.
And all right, I'll let AK Rex field the next question.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much. And yes, I do have, quite a good list of questions that just make you rather give me quite a bit of a sweat to see which one is best. But I decided to say it on topic here, and since we are on the T-Rex in particular. So one question I was emailed by one of the guys. He's one of the artists from the Mesozoic, the game developers. He's asking which hunting tactics do you personally believe T-Rex would have used, and which ones do you think they were most suitable for? So as an example, would it be as more of a pack hunter, a long-distance pursuer, solitary, or perhaps more like a chaser with, sprinter, all of these various things that come to mind? What do you think?
Well, in terms of the basic approach, definitely the juveniles and subadults were running. We know that big, full adult T-Rexes could not run. They're simply too large to do that. Bone has an intrinsic strength limit, and running would, they basically just break their legs. But that doesn't mean that adult T-Rexes were slow. Their legs and feet were longer than any of their prey, so they could have easily outpaced even the largest duckbills, triceratops, ankylosaurs, and so on. Tyrannosaurs were evolved to bite forcefully, and so their main means of prey capture and dispatching prey would have been with their heads. So with their long teeth and their powerful jaws and their long snouts. So the basic mechanism of capture and kill probably would have been the same throughout growth.
I see. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I wanted to add a bit of a comment here, and I hope Greg personally, I know that we're supposed to take turns technically, as we already agreed, but because there's a subject that just really kind of begs the next quick question.
All right.
I hope everybody is okay.
That's fine. If you have something to finish before you move on, I'll let you talk, AK.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's just there's something very interesting that was brought up as the way that T-Rex has evolved, and I had this personal. I've been investigating. Words are difficult tonight for some reason. I've had a whole day of. Anyway, I've been investigating the subject of this idea of convergent evolution between herbivore armor development and the prey weapon evolution. So, is it reasonable in this case to hypothesize, and prey on armored dinosaurs compared to, say, the earlier period theropods like allosauroids, like carcharodontosaurids, for example? So, does that make sense?
I think it's a reasonable hypothesis. I think that at the current time, the fossil record, at least for tyrannosaurids and armored dinosaurs in particular, is still pretty patchy to sort of really have a good, baseline of data to test that hypothesis. But I think it's a good one to keep an eye on. The evolution of armor and other such defenses are often a response to predators, but I just don't think we have the fossil record to really answer the question. I just want to jump back to the first question regarding pack hunting, and I think that it's important to keep in mind that tyrannosaurs were about as smart as crocodilians. And tyrannosaurs and crocodilians together are pretty dumb when compared to mammalian pack predators like wolves. So if tyrannosaurs were hunting in groups, they would only be about as competent or as organized as crocodiles. So I think that we have to proceed with the knowledge of that general level of intelligence for tyrannosaurs. And that steers us away of thinking of tyrannosaurs as hunting like mammals, which are much more intelligent.
Sure. Thank you very much. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, obviously, it might make them a little bit less sophisticated in terms of how they could, do the planning and all of these things. It's more about, probably situational things rather than, sit down, plan it, and then coordinate. You know what I mean? That answers the question pretty much. So thank you very much. And thanks, Greg, for letting me kind of follow up with the thought. And I think we can move on to the next.
I think that knocks out Sam's pack hunting question there, too.
Yep, it does.
Indirectly.
Yep.
All right, Scott has some. All right, since Scott just posted some questions, I think I'll let him have a chance here.
Well, I was just based on your description. It sounds like what you're talking about is a giant chicken with the head of a crocodile. Is that a good analogy?
That's a pretty good analogy, yes.
Yeah. The other question I had was, could the tail have potentially been used as a weapon sometimes to knock out prey or whatever, or during a fight?
I think that's a difficult question to answer, but I think one way of approaching it is just to consider what the primary means of offense would be for a tyrannosaur, and that's definitely the head. So I'd say that the skull, the head would be used to bite. It's easy to imagine the legs to help pin down prey. Then beyond head and foot, I think everything else becomes secondary. But that's just intuition. But I do think, given the form of the teeth and the high bite forces, that pretty much everything else becomes secondary in terms of hunting.
Okay, yep. Interesting. Okay, Sean, if you've got any questions you'd like to ask, now's your chance.
Okay, great. Well, this question, it doesn't come from me. It comes from a friend of mine. Matthew's his name. He's 8 years old, and he's really interested in the idea of T-Rex having feathers, because we've seen documentaries like The Real T-Rex with Chris Packham have kind of introduced a lot of people to the idea of a feathered tyrannosaur for the first time. I know the evidence, there doesn't seem to be any concrete evidence for feathers in Tyrannosaurus Rex just yet, but what would your opinion on the idea of a feathered Tyrannosaurus be? Do you think it's likely or unlikely based on its, I suppose, overall size and body mass?
Well, at first glance, it seems to make a lot of sense that Tyrannosaurids, like the animals like T-Rex, Daspletosaurus, Albertosaurus, would have feathers because, well, let's face it, it looks like feathers are probably ancestral for the pterosaur dinosaur group. We have filaments in pterosaurs and basal ornithischians and in a whole variety of theropods. But the evidence shows that in many dinosaur lineages that there was a switch back to scales. And that includes lineages like sauropods, which we have skin impression for, embryos and adults, ornithischians, including hadrosaurids and ceratopsians, and also among theropods like Carnotaurus, I think is a good example. Recently, just last year, my colleagues and I published a hypothesis for evidence of a scaly face in tyrannosaurids, which is based on the texture of the skull bones, of the facial bones in particular. And just a couple months later, Bell et al. Published on skin impression from a whole variety of tyrannosaurids.
Yep.
And those fossils show no evidence of feathers. And given that scales and feathers are made of the same type of protein, there's no reason to think that feathers, if present, wouldn't be preserved. However, none of the fossils show any evidence of feathers. And what's really cool about tyrannosaurs is their scales are small. They sort of look a bit like duckbill dinosaur scales. They're small and round. And they are known from all parts of the body, which includes the neck, the torso, the hip region, leg, and tail. And these samples are from animals like T-Rex, Tyrannosaurus bataar, both species of Albertosaurus, and Daspletosaurus. So we know that a scaly integument was present in Tyrannosaurids. It could have been that the switch from feathers to scales may have happened a bit further down the tree. But we also know that more primitive tyrannosauroids, animals like D-Long and Eutyrannus, did have feathers. So we know that the switchover from feather to scale happened somewhere between D-Long and, say, basal tyrannosaurids. We just don't know yet. And I do expect that eventually we'll find specimens of, say, Pistachiaversor or Appalachosaurus or Timerlangia with integument impression, and when that day comes, we'll be able to pin down where exactly the switchover happened in the Tyrannosaur family tree.
So I'm sorry, but Dr. Carr, would that include baby Tyrannosaurus Rex too? And also, it's interesting that you're saying that those scales on Daspletosaurus's face are sensitive. That was something new that's come out recently. Sorry for interrupting.
No problem. The notion of feathered tyrannosaur hatchlings is not based on any evidence at all. And from birds, as far as I'm aware, there's no evidence of a switchover from feathers to scales among any living birds. So we don't even have, a modern analog for that hypothesis. It really is at its very base fantasy. In terms of the sensitivity of tyrannosaur faces, that comes from the similarity of the integument type on the face of tyrannosaurs with that of crocodilians. They would have had these large flat scales. That's evidenced by the texture of the facial bones. And we had no reason to exclude the possibility that tyrannosaurids didn't have structures called integumentary sensory organs, which give the skin a hypersensitivity, give a scaly skin a hypersensitivity. And so the evidence based on the bones shows that tyrannosaurs almost certainly would have had those structures just like crocodilians, since they have the same integument type.
Thank you, Dr. Carr. That was rude, Mike Fredericks, who interrupted. I apologize.
No, it's not rude at all, actually. It's not at all. Yeah, Scott was asking about evidence of sensory pits on the snouts of tyrannosaurs, and I assume you've just covered that question, Dr. Carr.
Well, in crocodilians and tyrannosaurs, there isn't bony evidence for sensory pits. So in living crocodilians, they have a coarse texture on their facial bones, which is caused by the overlying scale type. Within those scales, there are these little bumps, that there's sort of little dome-like thickenings over tufts of very sensitive nerves. And so these little tufts, these little branches of facial nerve, or trigeminal nerve rather, enhances the tactile sensitivity. And so for tyrannosaurs, we are inferring that we have the same arrangement there. Now in terms of pits for sensory organs, those structures are not seen in crocodilians, nor are they seen in tyrannosaurids. But birds like ducks and geese do actually have specialized pits for tactile sensory organs at the tips of their beaks. But those structures had not evolved in either tyrannosaurs or crocodilians. So the sensory structures in crocs and tyrannosaurs is in the integument and is within the integument itself and does not leave a direct trace on the underlying bone.
I think that's a pretty satisfactory answer here. And AK had another relevant question about the Carr et al. 2017 paper.
Thanks very much, Greg, and thank you for answering those questions as well. It's always gives me a lot of pleasure personally to listen to and talk about Carr et al. 17 because of how interesting the material itself is. So lots of compliments from myself and my other crew who submitted their questions. Now, there is a question here that is made up of several parts, but it's really more related to some of the quote-unquote criticism that I have seen just through my own observation, and I was just wondering if it would be possible to have a quick response to that criticism here.
Sure. Bring it on.
Yeah, let's do it. So, does Carr et al. 17 prove? This is the first part of the question. Does Carr et al. 17 prove that tyrannosaurids and maybe theropods in general do not have lips? That's the first part. And the criticism towards it obviously says that the study apparently does not consider snakes or lizards for the comparison, while it considers other animal groups. And although we have studies that are consistent with this material presented in Carr et al. 17, like you have listed them, I believe, in our one-to-one session on my channel, the Barker et al. 17 with the Neovenator, and I believe you also cited Ibrahim et al. 2014 with the Spinosaurus, which shows the consistency. But, well, the final point of this multi-part question is, what's your response to this criticism, and how can we resolve this to settle this debate once and for all? Did they actually have lips, or did they have lizard lips, or did they just not have them, and were they more similar to how the crocodilians were with the exposed overbite? What's your response to that, Dr. Carr?
Well, the texture that provides evidence for the flat scales like crocodilians covers the entire snout and goes all the way to basically to the tooth row. So that removes any possibility for any other tissue to be present. And so, lizards and snakes aren't even on the table as viable comparisons. They don't in general have the same type of texture on their facial bones. So it's pretty straightforward. The texture goes all the way to the tooth row, and there's only evidence for one type of tissue type, and that points to the inescapable conclusion that tyrannosaurids were lipless, and possibly all theropods. That remains to be tested through very close examination of other theropod skulls, and seeing if this texture can be traced down to the bottom of the tree.
All right. Well, I suppose that pretty much takes care of that criticism, doesn't it? Wonderful.
I think so.
I'll take a sip of the tea for that. Cheers.
Okay.
Cheers.
Thanks very much for answering that one.
Sure, it's a good one.
All right, Scott, you're up next.
Okay, let's say through some accident, a T-Rex fell over on its side all the way on the ground, how hard of a time do you think it would have being able to get up and right itself because of the way it's built?
That's a good one. And I think that we would have to just take a look at living animals that are comparable in size, such as elephants. Even though elephants don't match T-Rex in size, I think they would be pretty good models for what our expectations should be. If a T-Rex actually fell over, I can't imagine how it, pardon me, I can't imagine how it wouldn't at least break some ribs. I have a harder time imagining a T-Rex not getting up after a fall like that. But that's, I'm way out on the plank of speculation here. I imagine them as fairly hardy animals. For example, there are many specimens that do have broken ribs, fairly high on the rib shaft too, which implies a fall. Tyrannosaurs often have broken fibulae. Specimens like Sioux, and I think even the Displetosaurus at the Field Museum with Sioux, I think, has a broken and rehealed fibula. It's a very common injury and doesn't seem to have really affected them because the fibulae are always in an advanced state of healing. So I think Tyrannosaurs in general had a rough and tumble life. I'm sure they were as clumsy as some living animals are, and that they would have probably skated through just as long as they didn't break their femur or tibia. That would put them in a very vulnerable position, not being able to walk. But aside from that, they're probably pretty hardy creatures.
They would have to use something for leverage to right themselves to get back up on their feet, though. And obviously, I can't see those little arms being of any help to do that.
Yes, but you have an entire body there that can wiggle around and writhe around and sort of help the animal get up.
Maybe the tail would help. I don't know. It's just... It's
and
really
basically, to stand up, all you have to do is shift your body weight around and get your feet underneath the center of mass, and you're fine. That actually might not take that much work, even for a big animal like that.
Yeah.
I actually tried that myself, but I only weigh 54 kgs, so who am I kidding, I guess?
Do you have puny arms?
I didn't use any arms. I was just like wiggling around like Dr. Carr said, but hey, I weigh 54 kgs. T-Rexes on average weight how much? Minimum 6 tons for an adult, maybe 7 or so. So, yeah.
Estimates, they range from 6 to 10.
Okay.
Imagine a T-Rex blunders onto a frozen lake. Now you see what a problem cats have. Imagine the problem a T-Rex would have.
This will generate a new meme that T-Rexes cannot ice skate.
Yeah.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah, I would actually have an artist create hashtag T-Rex ice skate fail.
Yeah, do that.
All right. Okay, with all the jokes aside, Sam would like to ask his next question.
Do you think there could have been species of tyrannosaurs that were even larger than Tyrannosaurus rex?
That's a very good question, and so far the fossil record's answer to that is no. T-Rex, as far as we know, is the biggest tyrannosaurid evolve. The femur length of T-Rex does not exceed 1.3 meters. All the adults, the femur length ranges from 1.2 to 1.3 meters, give or take a few centimeters. So after a century of collecting, I think that the sampling is dense enough that we can actually, accept the hypothesis that, that we've seen the top size for Tyrannosaurid. And next to other tyrannosaurs, T-Rex is astonishingly huge. So it's by no means a small animal. I mean, just to lift when I'm in a collection, I'm straining to lift a single jawbone. Like one dentary, I have to struggle to carry that thing to a table, or a maxilla, which is even heavier. So by no stretch of the imagination is T-Rex small, but I do think that it does represent the ceiling in terms of maximum tyrannosaurid size. Obviously, there's some theropods that do push beyond that limit, possibly Spinosaurus. Hopefully we'll have more complete material of that dinosaur sometime soon to really get a good sense of its maximum size. I think for tyrannosaurs, a T-Rex at the present time does represent the maximum limit. Does represent the maximum size limit for them. And we generally don't see other theropods that break that limit either, except possibly Spinosaurus.
Thank you very much. That was very informative.
Okay, I'll field my first question that sort of relates to what Sam was talking about, and it's about hypothetical upper size limits for tyrannosaurs that may not be knowable based on lack of fossil evidence. My question is, what is the likeliest hypothetical maximum or upper limit in length and weight that a Tyrannosaurus Rex could have achieved? I would have been entirely not outside the realm of possibility for there to have been tyrannosaurs that could have possibly reached lengths of like 45 to 50 feet and possibly weighing in excess of 10 tons or more. This is something I've based off of modern day crocodilians like saltwater crocs. Like the average recorded maximum length is around 20 to 23 feet, but there have been many stories dating back over centuries of crocodiles like 25 to possibly 30 feet in length. They're not around nowadays, of course, because of hunters. And I take that to speculate that Tyrannosaurus Rex could have possibly gotten bigger than, specimens like Sue. And this is something that's also been speculated on by Dr. David Hone in his book, Tyrannosaur Chronicles. What are your thoughts on this, Dr. Carr?
Yeah, I'm very empirical when it comes to these things. I like to keep a very tight leash on my hypotheses, and I do not like to speculate beyond what the evidence shows. And so, at the risk of repeating myself, we've been collecting adult T-Rexes since the late 1800s, and we have not seen any specimens suggest that T-Rex, so specimens like Sue, for example, T-Rex. I think we really are seeing the maximum size of that animal. And that tells us a lot about just the intrinsic limits of how big an organism can get, an organism like a theropod. So I think there's T-Rex represents a real opportunity to actually understand what the intrinsic physical limits are and phylogenetic or evolutionary limits at the same time. So I think that's probably the way to think about this. Like, don't get me wrong, when I'm out on the field with my volunteers, I often joke about finding that T-Rex with a 6-foot skull. And, I know that that'll almost certainly never happen, but that thought has crossed my mind. And the evidence just brings me back to the fact that, the biggest ones will be in that size range of Sue and the type and the other big ones, but no bigger than that.
That does make sense logically when you think about it. And I have one more question pertaining to size, and it's about the idea of sexual dimorphism. The question was, in your opinion, did the idea of female tyrannosaurs being larger than males come from? And I want to ask you, is this supported by scientific evidence, or as Dr. Holtz has mentioned in past lectures, that there really hasn't been any scientific evidence to justify female tyrannosaurs being larger than males?
Right. So the short answer to that is Dr. Holtz is correct as far as I'm aware. There is no evidence to show that female T-Rexes are larger than males. There's not even any reason to think that in the first place. That idea, I think, can be traced back to some amateur work. And the bottom line here is that only one female T-Rex has ever been unambiguously identified, and that's B. rex. which is a fairly famous specimen at the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman, Montana. And inside the femur of B. rex was found medullary bone. And this is a bone reserve that is seen in female modern birds when they're shelling eggs. They need a calcium reserve so they don't strip calcium from their own skeletons. And it turns out that this is a pretty ancestral feature for the bird theropod lineage, and T-Rex was no exception. So we've got to start breaking open a lot more T-Rex femora to identify females. I will say this about B. rex. I spent a lot of time studying B. rex, and on the face of it, B. rex looks like an ordinary T-Rex. It's relatively young, so it's not fully mature, but none of its would so in terms of overall appearance and size, there's no evidence for dimorphism, sexual dimorphism in T-Rex.
Yep, that makes absolute sense to me, and that's kind of actually become a meme in popular culture, like in documentaries and novels and movies that have the females being larger than the males, when in actuality it should be either the reverse, or there shouldn't be much of a discrepancy between the males and the females.
Yeah, they're skeletally, I don't see any dimorphic signal among adult T-Rexes, and I've seen a lot of them, and I'm sure I would have picked on dimorphism by now. I just simply don't see it. My own analyses don't recover dimorphism. However, that's based on the skeleton.
Did he answer?
It could be that maybe T-Rexes had a different coloration than females. But in terms of the overall skeleton, there isn't dimorphism, but it could be expressed in different ways. Hopefully someday we'll find out. We just need to find T-Rex mummies.
Yep, that's what we need to find here. And taking a detour from T-Rex to Daspletosaurus, I'll let Chris field this one about the difference between Daspletosaurus horneri and Daspletosaurus turosus.
Yeah, I was saying, because instead of recently been announced, I'm just curious, what are the differences between Daspletosaurus turosus and in your types of hypothesis?
Sure. The differences are subtle. They're subtle as the differences between Tyrannosaurus rex and Tyrannosaurus bataar. You really have to know the animals well to pick out the differences. But some of the more obvious ones is the horns. The horn in front of the eye of Turosus is very large. It's very tall and triangular. Whereas in Horneri, the horn is actually quite short, like from top to bottom. That's a pretty distinct difference. That's short horn is seen in subadults and full adults, whereas in Turosus, the adults really have a very tall triangular horn. The overall skull frame is a bit different. In Horneri, the skull is a bit taller throughout, and whereas it's a bit lower in Turosus. So we're talking about pretty subtle features, and the rest of those features are listed in the supplementary information in the Horneri article, and we show photographs of all of them. But I think your audience would just probably go to sleep or fall asleep just hearing all of them. But the main ones is the differences in the horns.
That's
Okay, hang with here, folks. We're having some sort of connection bugs here. Okay, if anyone can still hear me. Sean had a little question that tied into mine regarding Daspletosaurus to documentaries.
Yep.
Yeah, that's just we've spoken a lot about the general appearance of tyrannosaurs, so I suppose one of the things that I was kind of interested in is what, in your opinion, would be the best, or should I say, most accurate depiction of a tyrannosaur in popular culture? Because I know at the time, certainly in popular media, the Daspletosaurus and the Walking with Dinosaurs film, for all of its faults, was noted as being quite accurate. Is that a assumption you agree with?
Well, I'm still waiting. Well, okay. I guess I'll just state this flat out. Is in terms of documentary films, I think the most accurate Rex has ever done were for that BBC documentary on the dueling dinosaurs. So if you recall, they had digital animation of an adult and a juvenile T-Rex, of course, they called now Tyrannus. But despite all the other issues with that documentary, I was quite impressed with the quality of work. I don't know who the consultant was, I don't know who the artists were, but in terms of documentaries, in my view, those were the high watermark. Like, they really made an effort to get the heads right, and that's a real challenge. T-Rex is quite elusive in terms of accuracy, which is surprising. So, for example, there's recent documentaries that really tried to get Rex right, but really missed by a wide margin. So it's hard. It's hard to get T-Rex correct. And, the Jurassic Park T-Rex is not accurate, even though that look of T-Rex has come to be dominant in pop culture. I mean, many toys are based on the Jurassic Park T-Rex drawings and books, but that's not the face of T-Rex. But it's hard. It's hard to get T-Rex right.
Thanks.
Okay, AK Rex, he's up next.
Because you mentioned the documentaries, I have a question from a friend and an artist as well. His name is Aram Papazian. He's asked me to present this one. What is the best way to encourage documentaries and media to represent the information about dinosaurs correctly for the public?
That's a good question. I guess I'll answer it this way by just describing my own involvement with documentaries. I was reached by the BBC regarding the Real T-Rex documentary, and they wanted to ask me about the appearance of T-Rex, so, the scales on the face and feathers and all that. And the person I spoke to, it wasn't Chris Packham, it was one of his staff. And I mentioned to the person that their artists should really pay close attention to the appearance of the skull, that they have to get the skull of T-Rex right, because that's the foundation of everything else. And if they don't get the skull correct, then that's, they're just going to miss it. They're going to blow it. Kind of like, don't want to pick on Jurassic Park too much, but that's a convenient example. And, in my view, they didn't follow that advice. So even if you offer the best advice, it doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be taken. And when I speak to artists who ask similar questions of, how do I get T-Rex right? Could you let me know? Instead of giving people a list of features, I advise them to go to their local museum that has a cast of a T-Rex or a real T-Rex on display and spend time sketching it, photographing it, getting to know the skull in all its detail firsthand. And that way the individual artist builds up that necessary baseline of information so that they don't get it wrong.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And there was another interesting advice when you brought up advices that you give. I have been given one advice by also a professional, not very well known one, but still with a master's in English. shout out to Jeffrey Bond here, and he said one word of advice, just one word, literally, capital letters: read.
Yes, that too. Of course, the literature is vitally important. Absolutely.
Before we obviously move on, Sam here wanted to combine our question together, so we wanted to ask about the color. So my part of the question would probably be the first part of our combined question in this case, and it's whether we have any evidence for the color being preserved in tyrannosaurids in particular. Do we actually have anything to rely on, or do we not at this present time? And Sam, if you don't mind, maybe you can chime in and ask the second part of the question, unless it's the same thing.
That's hang on a second. Yeah, that's pretty much the same thing, actually.
All right.
Okay.
All right. I'll let you. All right.
As far as I know, so far we have no direct evidence for the color of T-Rex or any other tyrannosaur. So we just don't have the right fossils to answer that question. However, I will let you in on my own approach to arriving at coloration in tyrannosaurs and dinosaurs in general. And this is just a heuristic. It doesn't mean it is at all accurate. Generally, what I do is I go to crocodilians and I survey the species and find an analog for the animal of concern. So, T-Rex, maybe big saltwater crocodiles or Nile crocodiles would make sense as analogs. I try to match the crocodilian with the overall habitat of the dinosaur. So if, considering Dilophosaurus, which lived in a fairly arid environment, I think freshwater crocs make a lot of sense in terms of coloration. So I generally default to crocs. They're scaly, they're predatory, they overlap in habitat with dinosaurs, and that's the approach I take, for better or for worse.
So I suppose we can both agree that let's hope, that further evidence, whenever it comes, hopefully in our time and age, that will give us more answers. Thank you very much for answering this question. However, I think you did quite well, given the lack of evidence on a good approach of how to tackle.
Sure thing.
So basically green then.
Well, no, there's a variety of colors. That's a really cool thing about crocodilians, is there's quite a rich palette to work with. I tend to regard dinosaurs as very visual animals, and that the head would be sort of the locus of transmitting information in the form of color. And so that's why I had my artist Dino Polera color the cranium of Dyspleosaurus horneri with a reddish tone. And that's to match what's happening with the Cuvier's dwarf caiman, which among crocodilians has a fairly bright red head, or a reddish head. So I think there's a lot more variety among crocodilians than one would imagine at first glance. It's not all green, and it's not all brown either.
So
Yeah,
really,
Dino gave the Dyspleosaurus a real camouflage lower jaw, and Robert Bacher, by magazine once, he was saying that he thought T-Rex was probably camouflage and would be more brown if it was more deserty where it lived, and more green if it was more foresty, like that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to hear that Bob and I do agree on something. That's always good. Yeah, and actually the lower jaw of horneri is based on caimans. Most caimans do have those very distinct blotches on their otherwise light lower jaws.
the Cuvier dwarf caiman that you have brought up actually has a very interesting look. It's almost like dark, probably it's black more likely on its body, and it transitions to this kind of dark brick red. So imagine basically a Game of Thrones dragon with a brighter red face transferred on a T-Rex or something like that, and you got a cool-looking tyrannosaurid, which makes sense.
Yeah, they're lovely animals.
They're awesome and vicious as well, but awesome.
Yes, they most certainly are. Especially the bigger, the better.
Well, they say it's often the most beautiful creatures that are the most dangerous.
Yeah.
Yep. Which, okay, Mike, did you have any questions you'd like to field, Dr. Carr?
Too many. Let's just move on. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, I'd love to ask some questions. Well, I was researching you, Dr. Carr, even though I was well aware of you before today, of course.
Sure.
But I was looking on your Twitter and your Facebook, and I see a lot of your Canadian background there in the sense of friends that I have from Canada, including Dino Polera and Garfield Minot, and it was really nice of you to mention Gary Williams' wife passing. That was a big shock I heard the other day. But anyway. Yeah. Another common friend we have is Mr. Steve Brussatte, who loves you in his new book. He calls you his dearest paleontologist friend, although he doesn't compliment your attire very nicely. And he disagreed. Big shock, but paleontologists disagree on some things. And he definitely thinks T-Rex was feathered. He definitely thinks T-Rex was as smart as, say, an ape, even. And, of course, Phil Curry thinks that they hunted in packs because he found a number of skeletons close together, you know. So, obviously, people differ in their opinions. One thing really interesting that Steve said when I interviewed him was that, and I thought you could comment on this, was the speed at which T-Rex grew. He's saying, I may be wrong on this, but something like 10 pounds a day for his whole teen years. So how much food is that, you know? That's what I want to ask about.
Yeah, it's a lot of food. That's what Steve is saying is consistent with the evidence. Incredibly fast growth rates. That work, by and large, has been done by Greg Erickson down at FSU in Tallahassee. And T-Rex has a growth rate that is much higher than any other tyrannosaurid. The growth rates of animals like Daspletosaurus, Albertosaurus libratus, Albertosaurus sarcophagus didn't come anywhere close to what's seen in T-Rex. So it was eating, probably many, many pounds of food a day. The exact mass, I could only speculate.
Sure.
But it's truly impressive, and it actually says a lot about the environment of T-Rex, that the biomass was there to support a predator like that, as voracious as that, with such an intensely high growth rate. So it actually provides some evidence of the broader world that T-Rex lived in.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, here we have quite a few questions here regarding the specific genus Tarbosaurus here. Me, Sean, and AK have a bunch of questions combined together here. I'll field off all the ones that Brendan Lee on Facebook submitted, and I'll also submit my own as well. The first question Brendan asks about Tarbosaurus, and you guys might answer this one as well, is he want to know why is Tarbosaurus so similar to Tyrannosaurus Rex? And also regarding, did Tyrannosaurs really radiate from Asia, as in was this their birthplace or cradle of evolution, so to speak?
Sure.
Alright, my real specific question was about the interaction between Tarbosaurus and Zhuxing tyrannus. My question is as follows. Is there any good evidence that Zhuxing tyrannus, Magnus, and Tarbosaurus bataar were contemporaries? And if they were in fact contemporaries, how would you picture the interspecific predatory relationship between the two similar-sized tyrannosaurs? And this will segue into the other Tarbosaurus-themed questions that Sean and Arson have.
Sure. Okay, starting with the start. So why is Tyrannosaurus bataar and T-Rex so similar? The answer to that question stems from the family trees. So the phylogenies of dinosaurs are very meaningful in terms of answering those questions. If you look at any of the recently published family trees of Tyrannosaurus, whether it's Carr et al. 2017 or Brussatte and Carr 2016, you'll see that T-Rex and T-Batar trace back to a single common ancestor. And since they share a common ancestor to the exclusion of all other tyrannosaurs, then it's a given that they're going to look more similar to each other than to any other tyrannosaur, and that's exactly what we see. There are several important differences between Rex and Batar, including size, but also very discrete features that separate them out quite neatly as different species. But that's where similarity comes from. Similarity between organisms comes from common ancestors. So we can identify specific features that, say, unite T-Rex, T-Batar, and Zhucheng tyrannus. Features like, a really big maxillary fenestra unites that small group of Tyrannosaurus. But also the presence of DNA in all living things is evidence that all living things on this planet evolved from a single common ancestor that arose sometime shortly after the planet formed, about 4.5 billion years ago. So similarities mean common ancestry. So to move to the next question regarding the Asian origins of T-Rex, if we take a look back at the family tree, we see that T-Rex is nested within a group of Asian tyrannosaurs. So in terms of the evolutionary sequence, we have Zhucheng tyrannus, which is from China. Then after that, Tyrannosaurus batar evolved. And that pretty much establishes an Asian lineage of tyrannosaurs. Given that T-Rex is the closest relative, the sister species of batar suggests that T-Rex had to, or at least the ancestral stock of T-Rex, started off in Asia and had to get to Western North America, or Laramidia. So that's the sort of the basic parts of that hypothesis. And given how closely spaced Batar and Rex are in time, that also is consistent with the hypothesis that T-Rex was effectively an Asian immigrant toward the end of the Maastrichtian. And I think, and then there's the last question, that's, did Zhucheng tyrannus and T. batar, were they sympatric? And the evidence suggests that Zhucheng tyrannus went extinct before T. batar evolved. There's no specimens of Zhucheng tyrannus from the Namek at all. The only other type of tyrannosaurian, like Tyrannosaurus, is Raptor rex, of which we have only a single specimen, which is a juvenile. There are no adult Raptor rex known, at least not yet. And so until that day comes, we won't know how Batar and Raptor rex were ecologically partitioned. We do have examples of other sympatric tyrannosaurs like Albertosaurus libratus and Daspletosaurus turosus. And it's generally thought that given their difference in size, so libratus is fairly sleek, Daspletosaurus is a bit heftier, it's been hypothesized that they were niche partitions somehow. For example, Dale Russell thought Daspletosaurus would have hunted ceratopsids, whereas libratus would have hunted hadrosaurids. We really don't know. There's no direct evidence for that. But when we look around the modern world, we see that large predators tend to quite easily partition their ecospace. So, for example, coyotes and wolves, coyotes and foxes, wolves and bears, tigers, and other large, African predatory mammals. So, to paraphrase Jurassic Park, life finds a way, and so do predators.
Yep, that true. What? Yep, modern. Yep, I would have to absolutely agree with that assessment. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
If I can join the T. batar questioning, just on your point there, Greg, about things being the same. I noticed, Dr. Carr, that you mentioned Tyrannosaurus bataar a few times there, whereas oh, there's a dog barking. Back in the day,
Not my dog.
I just recall it. I'm probably maybe a bit behind the times now, but last I remembered, we used to call it Tarbosaurus bataar. So there was always a bit of controversy or debate as to whether it should be Tyrannosaurus bataar or Tarbosaurus bataar. Has the, I suppose, jury come back on that one, or do we know what the defining difference to make them part of the same genus is yet?
Well, what you've uncovered is the actual subjectivity that's involved in taxonomy. So taxonomy is the rationale for naming animals scientifically. And there's a couple of schools of thought, and I'll just describe mine. And that is that I think that as scientists, as taxonomists, our job is to maximize information content, because when you do that, that makes communication more efficient. And so I structure the names that I use, genus names like Tyrannosaurus, Daspletosaurus, Lithranax. Those are genus names, not species names. I think that genus names should be aligned with the family tree, the phylogeny. So, for example, T-Rex and T-Bataar are sister species. They share one ancestor to the exclusion of all others. Given that relationship, I recognize a lineage called Tyrannosaurus with two species in it, Rex on the one hand and Bataar on the other. So when I say Tyrannosaurus bataar, you should intuitively or immediately know his closest relative is T-Rex. That maximizes information content. I do the same with Albertosaurus, Albertosaurus and Albertosaurus sarcophagus, Albertosaurus libratus. They're each other's sister species. There's no reason to call them different genera. Same thing with Ailoramus. In following this train of thought, it's one lineage, Ailoramus, with two species, Sinensis and Remotus. And following the Brussatte and Carr phylogeny, there's two species of Tratophonius, Currii and Hoglandi. So that's my own particular bias. It's not necessarily more correct than when people use Tarbosaurus, Gorgosaurus, Nanuqsaurus, Kionzosaurus, and so on. It's just my preference is to maximize information content, which I don't think using different generic names actually do, because they obscure relationships. They don't actually specify them. But I'm alone. No one else does this. I'm alone in the woods on it, so you can take it or leave it.
Well, all right. Thanks for clearing that up. Maybe I suppose part of me thinks that I guess some of us we like generic names. I think just as people we like to put a name in everything, because Tyrannosaurus, Tarbosaurus, and I guess the idea of making T-Rex very unique has its own appeal as well. If there was another Tyrannosaurus out there, maybe it might seem less special. But I guess I'm kind of speculating now. So I guess thanks for that. We can move on now. There's some good questions coming.
Sure.
Someone's banging the microphone a lot.
Yeah, I think it was just a minor technical thing there with the typing, so it happens. In any case, Sean, are you okay with your part of the Tarbosaurus question? Shall I chime in, or you're good to go now, yeah? Okay.
Absolutely, that cleared things up wonderfully.
Cool, awesome sauce. In any case, well, I've got this one here from Mr. Robert Fabiani, and he asked me to ask you, Dr. Carr, how much difference would you expect to see in the bite force exerted from a T-Rex skull compared to that of the T-Bataar?
Oh, definitely T-Rex would be higher. Bataar would be lower. I would not expect in orders of magnitude, but pretty close. There is some variation in the estimated bite forces for T-Rex. There is a range there. There's been more than one publication done by different workers on this question. But I would expect that they would be in the neighborhood. I would expect that Zhucheng Tyrannus as well would be in the neighborhood of lower but similar bite forces compared to Rex. And for the rest of the tyrannosaurs, I would expect them all to be lower than that group. That triumvirate of Zhucheng, Batar, and Rex have very deep jaws and thicker teeth compared to the others. So I think we're dealing with, I think they represent a unique innovation in the lineage toward maximizing bite force. And who knows, the reason for that might have something to do with that just simply being a more efficient way of capturing prey that's less costly to the predator. That's a different sort of question that this, that this leads to. I don't know the answer to that. Just the work hasn't been done. But that's my general impression. It's not based on anything quantitative yet.
So basically nothing yet empirical to obviously produce any data set, but reasonable reasonable doubt area, so to speak, to suggest that obviously T-Rex would be still on a upper end, while the other two could be close runners-up, but how much, hard to say. Is that what it is, basically?
Yep, exactly.
Okay. Cool beans. In any case, I think we are ready for the next question, and I'll just wait to see what else comes up and when to take my next turn. Thank you very much for answering.
Sure.
Okay, all right, Sam, you're on base.
In your personal opinion, how do you think Tyrannosauruses would have evolved had they not gone extinct?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And it's sort of like asking a historian to imagine, what would have happened if, say, World War I or World War II went the other way. You can kind of get a sense, but it doesn't really provide a clear picture. But I guess we can take our cue from a couple things. The group that T-Rex belongs to seems to be part of a trend for increasing bite force. T-Rex seems to have hit the maximum size ceiling for tyrannosaurs. So it seems that the only direction that T-Rex could possibly go, if it didn't become extinct, was it possibly could have become a founder species of, of multiple different species. Appalachia and Laramidia were joining toward the end of the Maastrichtian, sort of reuniting what was once a separate North America. That represents opportunity for diversification, but in what direction? That would be anyone's guess. We know from ailuramens that a very shallow snout can evolve from a deep-snouted ancestor, so possibly that could have been on the table. We've seen small body size evolve in tyrannosaurs more than once. Maybe that's a direction that T-Rex could have gone into. So we can also use the overall history of tyrannosaurs or the evolution of tyrannosaurs as a guide, but there's really no way to identify any particular direction that the history of T-Rex could have gone in. It's an intriguing question, though.
Thank you very much.
I have a question that sort of relates into the whole hypothetical what if, dinosaurs hadn't gone extinct. This is from the question submitted from Ben Jenkins. He wants to know, how well do you think tyrannosaurs would compete in today's environments across the globe?
Well, they would have not stood a chance against people. If they were around, they'd probably be extinct by now, or they'd be in absolutely desperate situations like many large animals are. It's not too hard to imagine large theropods being hunted to extinction for, irrational things like, traditional medicine, that sort of thing. So I think they'd be in really deep trouble in the modern world had they evolved successfully up to this point. But I just think humans are a devastating force upon large vertebrates, large terrestrial vertebrates particularly.
Yeah, Assuming if humans were not a factor in all this, then do you see things being a little different? For example.
Well, I guess one way of approaching this is, what if the meteor strike didn't make dinosaurs go extinct? There'd be two immediate outcomes of that. Dinosaurs, non-avian dinosaurs, would have almost certainly persisted to the modern day, and consciousness wouldn't have evolved. On this planet, consciousness is unique to us. And had dinosaurs survived, the universe would have had no opportunity to know itself through a conscious species. Dinosaurs had every opportunity to evolve consciousness over their very successful stretch from the Triassic to the end of the Cretaceous, and it simply didn't happen. So, at least on this solar system and this part of the galaxy, it would have been as mindless as it ever was. I know that's a little bit further afield than your immediate question, but I think that's one thing that we have to sort of proceed with the knowledge of, that we are in a unique position in terms of the natural world.
That's a pretty good. It's still a good answer to me, all the same.
Could I ask kind of a what if question too? Since we're in that world, when I interviewed Steve Brussatte for my next issue, and also artist Todd Marshall, who helped him illustrate his new book, I asked a silly question that I thought they would just laugh at me but no, they loved it. So I'll ask you the question too.
Sure.
What do you think would... we all wish we had a time machine and could go back to see the dinosaurs. And I know it depends on which time period we went back to, but say the late Cretaceous. What do you think would happen to a human that went back there?
Well, if I were going to take the time machine, I'd also take an armored Humvee with a 50mm cannon on it.
Yeah.
And I'd want my Humvee to be amphibious too. I think that's the only reasonable way to survive a night, say in the late Maastrichtian, just given the power in T-Rex and also the relative abundance of theropod predators in that fauna. There's at least one dromaeosaurid to worry about. There's troodontids, who knows, what they could have successfully picked on, oviraptorids, and who knows how aggressive Triceratops would have been, let alone duckbills and ankylosaurs. So I think it would have been a dangerous world. I mean, you wouldn't be safe on land because of the Tyrannosaurus. You wouldn't be safe in the trees because the dromaeosaurids would be up there. Uh-huh. And you wouldn't be safe on the beach either because the mosasaur could probably grab you. And you're not safe on the rivers because that's where the crocs are. So, the dinosaurian world is one that is extraordinarily difficult to imagine, just in terms of the fauna, but also the scale. Like, we're dealing with animals that exceed elephants in size, and that's not only the predators but the herbivores as well. Just completely beyond any human experience, and the only place on the world where that comes close would be in Africa, and even then, the biggest of those animals, elephants, are small next to dinosaurs. So my advice is go prepared.
Yes, thank you. I agree.
Yep.
I could be wrong about this, but I think probably the only place you really would have any chance of being safe is in a cave. I could be wrong about that, though.
Well, the young Tyrannosaurs would just pull you out. They'd go in there and grab you.
And there's also death from above.
Yes, it's not a picnic. That's why you need the Humvee.
Yeah, you would need that, especially against Quetzalcoatlus. I mean, you wouldn't think they were deadly, but they were just as terrifying predators as any T-Rex.
I wouldn't take my chances, so I'm with you there.
No.
We're going to have to cancel our holiday plans, so...
Yeah, I'm pretty so.
Uh-oh.
So basically, you're not safe anywhere, no matter where you go.
I'm just glad that the Quetzalcoatlus are extinct.
Oh, yeah. Just go back
Otherwise, you'd be like a walking Swiss cheese or a walking grid of sword by now.
Yeah. Anyhow, AK, you had a hypothetical question you wanted to ask?
I do indeed, yes. In fact, I believe it kind of... well, first of all, yes, I wanted to make a quick comment regarding to the earlier discussion about how, would you survive among dinosaurs, is that I'm currently working on a medieval fantasy novel. So the way I worked around the present solution is that they would fortify their towns and build walls and castles and stuff like that to keep them out. The problem, however, is I need to still come up with an idea of how they come to that point in the first place and haven't been obliterated by that point to make that happen. So I'm still working on that solution. So you're gonna have to bear with me on that. But the question for me is this one. I believe I may have asked you in one of our one-to-one discussions earlier on, but I thought maybe other people might be curious to hear your answer right now. If you could summon a ghost of a dinosaur to present time, and you were allowed to ask for 3 questions or make 3 wishes, for example, show me blah blah blah, or what would you do, or how do you do this, etc. So these kind of things, and together you were allowed only 3 things. Which 3 things would you ask? And which dinosaur ghost would you summon if you could obviously choose any?
I guess I'll summon the ghost of T-Rex, and well, I guess what I would ask for is a time lapse of how it grew up, from fertilization to adulthood.
That's a 1.
That's 1. Okay, I get 2 more.
Yep. You can wish for something as well. For example, you could ask them to show you something if you want, or it could just be 2 questions. Anything really, but you have 2 more things. After that, the ghost disappears.
This is tough.
It's a funny little game here, but yeah, it's a tough one to crack. In fact, anybody can think of their own versions if you want and write them in the chat.
This is interesting here. Dinosaur Jin? Oh, wow.
We'd love to know what you look like, of course. Scanning stuff.
Yep, that's good. Yep, what do you look like? And I guess my second one would be how intelligent. So demonstrate, the maximum level of intelligence, and also retrace your ancestral steps. I'd really like to know what the ancestral stock of T-Rex looked like before it left Asia.
Awesome.
So I don't know if those are especially lame wishes.
I think they pretty much would answer everything.
Yeah.
Well, me personally, I would like to know how difficult it would be to survive in those times. That's one question I'd ask it. How difficult is it to survive back in those days?
Probably one of the partially, if you combine this to the I believe it was the second question of Dr. Carr's, basically how intelligent you are. That's basically the same way of thinking of how capable are you of problem solving. So that in itself can already give you a very good clue, and as to many other similar questions as to how likely it was able to survive and things like that, because that requires a degree of problem solving. But that's my suggestion, at least. So, I don't know.
Makes sense?
Maybe it does, yeah. Maybe it does not, because we haven't been able to summon the ghost of Tyrannosaurus yet, but I just think it would be a really fun thing to do one time. If it works, I mean.
It's a fun thought experiment.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, a scary thought experiment at the same time.
That too.
You would like that, Greg, though, wouldn't you?
I don't know, man. You shouldn't be if there's one thing that they constantly preach in, material like this, is that man shouldn't tamper with, powers beyond his understanding. This would be an example of such a thing, I would imagine.
Don't mess with the past.
Okay, I've got my next question from Ben Jenkins. It's also sort of speculative nature. He asks, what do you suspect is highly probable about tyrannosaurs, but we will not have evidence to prove it?
Well, I do think that color is probably one of those things that we won't have evidence for. I do expect that Tyrannosaurus T-Rex mummies in particular will be found. I'm sure that day will come where we'll have a good picture of the entire integument of the body, and like the duckbills that have come out of Wyoming and other late Maastrichtian localities. So I think we'll know that, but I do suspect that the evidence for coloration won't be there. I'll be happy to be wrong about that, but I do think coloration is not accessible through the fossil record. And I also suspect that knowledge of the internal organs will forever be beyond our grasp.
That does make sense. And I've got two more I'd like to knock. Ben's got two final questions here, and this one is a fun one. The first one is: if you had discovered the first fossils of T-Rex, what would you have named him? And his other one is, I'm not sure how I would describe this. He asks, what can we learn about the successes and failures of this T-Rex species, if it makes any sense?
Gotcha. In terms of the name, I mean, no one can top Tyrannosaurus Rex. And, Osborne came up with another name for a Tyrannosaurid, Dynamasaurus imperiosus, which turned out to be synonymous with T-Rex. So I just think those two names are unbeatable. And so that sort of empties out my imagination. I do have a genus name that I want to use for, if I ever name a new genus of Tyrannosaur, but I cannot share that with you. Otherwise, I won't be able to use it.
Oh, come on.
I can't. I would make, it's against protocol.
Yeah, no, I'm just joking.
Yeah. And lessons to learn from T-Rex. I think the story of T-Rex is one of success. So we have a Tyrannosaurid coming in from Asia into Western North America, and basically replacing all the resident large predators. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a very good handle on Tyrannosaur diversity between 69 and 71 million years ago. We know that in that time range, we at least had Albertosaurus sarcophagus in Alberta, and the Tratofonius hoglundi up in Alaska. So that implies a high diversity of Tyrannosaurs throughout Laramidia right before Rex came in. And when Rex arrived, it basically beat all the others down. And that might just be part and parcel of being an invasive species. But T-Rex was an invasive species par excellence. It would have entered Laramidia already a giant, already having those high bite forces. But the fossil record does not preserve those initial million years from 69 to 68 million years ago. And so I hope that at some point we'll find exposures that fill that gap. The other lesson of T-Rex is that it went extinct with all the rest. And that speaks to the vulnerability of basically the global ecosystem when faced with a global catastrophe. And that's pretty much the situation that we're in now, although on a slightly slower pace of disintegration. I'm talking about climate change and global warming here. So I think there's a positive lesson, and there's also a dire one when it comes to T-Rex.
Yep, that goes that extinction isn't always a bad thing, despite what some people might want us to think.
Maybe it just is what it is, really. Like, it's not a bad or good thing. It's just factual thing, because facts don't have good or bad. They're just facts. They just happen. I suppose that's the way I interpret it personally. But I can see why it could be good for us, though.
It all depends on who's going extinct.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm not saying about me going extinct. I don't want to go extinct. I still want to live a happy life until I'm, I'm not going to say it because I want to keep it very good kind of rating, but if you want to know the appropriate quote, look up the part in Game of Thrones when Tyrion Lannister's, answers the question of how he wants to die. Look that quote up and you will know my answer, but I won't voice it here for obvious reasons.
All right. I have just 2 more questions that I'd like to finish up.
Sure.
The first one is, what are your views on the parenting behavior of Tyrannosaurus?
Well, I think that given the similarity in intelligence between Tyrannosaurs and crocodilians, I think crocodilians are the default model for understanding the behavior of large, relatively intelligent theropods. So I think that for most aspects of the reproductive biology, I think crocodilians provide a better model than birds do. So I think we would look to crocs in terms of, nest guarding, short period of time guarding hatchlings once they've left the nest, maybe having almost a creche-like arrangement for some months. And also I think crocodilians are really good models for courtship behavior too, considering that both crocodilians and tyrannosaurs had hypersensitive faces in terms of their tactile sensations. Tyrannosaurs, like crocodilians, would have also been hypersensitive to temperature. We know that female crocodilians use their snouts to assess the temperature of the ground before they dig a nest and lay their eggs. They also monitor nest temperature with their snout. And so I think tyrannosaurs would have done the same thing with the same equipment, given that they have the same anatomy and the same level of intelligence. So I think at the end of the day, crocodilians are the model to follow. And I think that's a helpful rule of thumb for, say, artists who want to depict tyrannosaurs doing realistic activities.
That's a very good answer. My second question,
Have we lost him by any chance?
for pain, but mammals couldn't have reviews on that.
Well, that's a good question. That requires knowledge of the physiology of pain and also understanding pain reception in a variety of vertebrates. I mean, that's a very good question. I would default to, again, for dinosaurs and pterosaurs, I would default to crocodilians to gain as establishing a baseline for that lineage of archosaurs. So what that means is that crocodilians are the representative of the ancestral condition for archosaurs. And so if that's true, then all archosaurs would at least have the same type of pain tolerance. And then we'd have to compare crocs with, say, pain tolerance in basal mammals like monotremes and marsupials. And that I just simply don't know how all that shakes out. But that's the way I think about the question. I'll just add this, that I've seen skeletons of crocodiles with terrible injuries, like just terrible osteomyelitic injuries to their snouts, where there's bone missing, there's pus channels that are active, and the animals survived the initial injury. Even on the Crocodile Hunter, they featured a big old salty, I think nicknamed Stumpy, that was missing half of its lower jaw. Like, atrocious injury these animals can survive. So if crocs are any indication, I'm sure dinosaurs could have tolerated quite a bit of extreme physical damage.
So I assume then that, if it's the same thing for dinosaurs, I assume then the dinosaurs would probably also have a very high degree of tolerance for pain, I assume.
I don't know. That's the thing. See, all basically all amniotes have the same basic set of neurological equipment. On the face of it, the baseline assumption is no difference. That's the null. I think what this points toward, at least for crocodilians and dinosaurs, is their immune systems were, on the face of it, are pretty efficient. We know that crocs can tolerate, having their snouts ripped off, limbs ripped off, and they'll survive it and just live on to a good old age. There's not much reason to think dinosaurs were any different, but that speaks more directly to immune system, but not necessarily pain. So it's a good question. I don't know the answer to it.
Very much.
Dr. Carr, about Appalachiosaurus, I'd hate to not hear something about that before you go.
Sure.
Is it definitely a tyrannosaur? And I know Greg wanted to ask you, what do you think how long do you think it got as an adult?
Well, Appalachiosaurus, the type specimen, is a subadult, and one of its closest relatives is Dryptosaurus. And if memory serves, I think the type specimen of Dryptosaurus is a little bit bigger. I think the femur is a bit longer than Appa. What that suggests is that maybe ancestrally, the Dryptosaurus, Appalachiosaurus, tyrannosaurid line was ancestrally probably 8 to 9 meter adult length. There's a huge increase in size that separates that lineage from earlier and smaller tyrannosaurs like Timerlangia, Xiangguanlong, and so on. So we do have a distinct group of tyrannosaurs in North America before the seaway, the Western Interior Seaway, split North America into eastern and western halves. So that ancestral stock that gave rise to things like Appa on the one hand, T-Rex on the other, were almost certainly large. So we're talking the 8 to 9 meter range, and I'd expect adult Appalachiosaurus to be in that size range as well.
Yep, that's a very good answer. Dr. Carr and Mike saved my butt there of that one. I have one more Appalachiosaurus question here. And
Sure.
And it was there any relationship between it and Appalachiosaurus? This was originally submitted to me by Brendan Lee.
Okay, so relationship between Appa and Drypto?
Correct.
Okay, so if you take a look at the phylogeny, at the family tree, all the big tyrannosaurs evolved from one common ancestor. That's the big ones from North America and Asia. The first one to branch off was Dryptosaurus. Then the second one to branch off was Appalachiosaurus. Then after Appa, there's Bistahioversor and the Tyrannosaurids. What that means is that Appalachiosaurus is more closely related to Bistahioversor and Tyrannosaurids than it is to Dryptosaurus, because Dryptosaurus is one ancestor out from that group.
We're going to have to do it now. We'll come here, they're doing it all the time.
Oh, sorry about that.
Did you get that?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
Well, I think for the most part. Anyhow, Sean, you had one final question before you have to exit the stage?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's like, I have to bow out now. It's getting a little bit past my bedtime out here in Ireland. So, firstly, thanks, Dr. Carr, for all your questions. We all greatly appreciate it. So, the last question I just want to ask was put forward to me by youngster there, 8-year-old named Matthew. He just wanted to know, what is your absolute favorite thing about being a paleontologist?
I get to study tyrannosaurs.
Short answer. Simple as. Okay.
Yep.
Sorry, did I cut you off there?
No, I just said yep.
Okay, all right. Okay, so that's all from me. So thanks again, Dr. Carr. Great talking to you, and to the rest of you guys. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome,
Thanks
Sean.
for having me.
All right. Talk soon.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Take care, Sean. Was nice seeing you.
And I think this would be a good way to segue into things that pertain to paleontology here, if we want to take a temporary detour from talk about specific dinosaurs here. Chris had a question here about the Hell Creek Formation. He wanted to know, how many times have you been out to the Hell Creek Formation?
Yeah, so I have a field program where we collect dinosaurs and basically every fossil we can find from the Hell Creek Formation in southeastern Montana. And my field program started in 2006. We've been out there almost every summer except for 2009, 2010. We're usually on the field for 2 years on and 1 year off. Although in recent years we've been going out pretty much every field season that we can. The reason for that is sometimes there are fossils that we had no time to collect, and so we go back for them, for a shorter amount of time. Usually we're out there for a month. Last year we were out for 2 weeks to rescue some specimens that we ran out of time to collect the year before. So it's almost been a solid decade.
Okay, Arson had a question about Hell Creek itself.
Yes, thanks very much for handing over the mic, Greg. And I wanted, there's a question coming here from Joshua Ballze, and you have heard of him because you have reviewed his collective tyrannosaurid skin diagram on my channel,
yes.
and you have also reviewed his Tyrannosaurus Rex black and white portrait, the very lovely jubbly piece where you gave your good tips and hints, and he has updated it since as well. I will show you next time we get to chat. In any case, he is asking a question here. This is just basically to kind of clear up some, misconceptions and myths, basically. Just try to debunk them while we have the opportunity.
Yep.
So, what are your thoughts on the climate of Hell Creek and how this affects things like the presence or lack of quote-unquote feather integument on Tyrannosaurus? That's the first part. Second part is, being that we have Tyrannosaurs with no feathers, but we've seen people argue that they should have them if places like Hell Creek were not tropical or humid and so on, then animals like Tyrannosaurs should have this, which goes against the fossil data. So what is your opinion and response to these statements, and why are they true or false depending on the stance? Mike, over to you, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, overall, throughout Hell Creek time, there was a warming trend that's known from plants, but that doesn't have any influence on the hypothesis of scaly tyrannosaurs. So all the fossil evidence is pointing in the direction of scales and T-Rex. There's no ecological or temperature argument can be brought to the table that will change that fact. And we know that many other dinosaur lineages were scaly, and that's the result of common ancestry. And so these are two separate issues.
Gotcha. Thanks very much. I mean, you've brought up that we have some other lineages showing. We have examples of also, I remembered, very good preservations. Can't remember which collection it's from. They recently, that's popped up, the good preservation of the armored dinosaur. Anybody know which collection it's part of? The one that has almost a very, it's got the head, it's got a very big portion of the body with all the osteoderms, and I believe Julius Xatoni did, sorry if I'm butchering the name by the way, did a wonderful piece of art on it as well. Do you know which collection? Which one?
Borealopelta?
Borealopelta, yeah. Do you know which collection it belongs to currently? Or is it unassigned?
Museum.
Royal Tyrrell, yeah, that's right, Royal Tyrrell, yeah. And the lineage from it also, there's also an Antarctica Pelta, which is also an armored dinosaur from this family, which lived in Antarctica. And is there a way to say that they would have been living in a cold environment and still have scales and no need for being fluffy, if I may say so?
Yes. Yeah, I think there's many lines of evidence like that can be brought to answer the sort of the challenge that comes from annual temperature argument that was made. We do have the fossils just to show what the integument was, and despite that, climate is something that's a moving target on relatively short time scales and does not appear to have any influence at all on the evolution of integument. Those are two quite separate things.
So in other words, then it means that the evolution of integument is a much larger scale process compared to how, long or short, depends how you look at it as well, the climate change period would be. So climate change period would just not be long enough to truly make that effect. So I'm just trying to kind of reiterate to see if I got the point. Am I getting the point right?
Yep. I think you did a better job of expressing that than I did.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm now gonna be getting quite a bit cocky here at this point. This is a perfect excuse. Dr. Carr approved stamp. Right. Thank you very much for answering the question. So I'll head over the mic to Greg now.
Okay. I'd like to say that the Prehistory Time magazine readers voted the Boreal pelta as the best scientific discovery of 2017.
Oh, it's amazing. It's so awesome. I want to see it in person.
It is.
That's cool.
Same here. I'd love to see that thing in person.
More armor on the table for me, please. I just love everything armor related, both medieval and in the animals. So yes, I would like to see that in person.
Anywho, Chris had two final questions before he had to bow out. The first part one is, which Tyrannosaur specimen have you studied the most, and is there a group of dinosaurs that you would like to study more?
Okay. I've spent in recent years. I spent most of my time studying the Spleosaurus horneri, in particular MOR 1130. That's the full adult horneri. I think I've given it the most time. Probably equal to that is I've been writing up the monograph of Jane, which is a subadult T-Rex that was collected about a decade ago by the Burpee Museum. And I work on Jane every day. I'm trying to get a book-length description done. And so actually, on second thought, I think I work on Jane more than anything else. So Jane is first, and then MOR 1130. And then the type of horneri, that's MOR 590, comes in at third. So right now, those are the three that get most of my attention. But Jane is every day.
Yep. I figured you would have worked on Jane, because I've seen you. I think you were in a documentary, The Mystery Dinosaur, concerning Jane's identity.
Yes, I was. I was in there briefly.
Yeah, that kind of...
Is Neotyrannus definitely a baby T-Rex now, too?
Yes, all the evidence points in that direction. The key specimen, the Cleveland skull, has all the features of a juvenile Tyrannosaur in general, and it has features only seen in T-Rex. So the simplest hypothesis is that it's a juvenile T-Rex.
Cool.
There's no reason to imagine it's anything else than that.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Would part of your reasoning for that come from the study of bone histology, as Dr. Holly Woodward postulated in her lecture at DinoFest just this past year?
I deal with all other lines of evidence except histology. And the cool thing is that all the lines of evidence are consistent with each other. So in some ways, the histology acts as a test of my hypotheses of growth in T-Rex, and in some ways, my growth series, which are based on other types of data, are a check on histology. As a matter of fact, I found that one adult T-Rex, MOR 555, that's the nation's T-Rex that was recently moved from the MOR to the Smithsonian. Through my work, we found that the original ring leg count. So dinosaurs grow annually, and they grow fast, or they grow at a constant rate throughout most of the year. Then they slow down or stop, and they start again. So you have these rings in the bones, and through my work, we found that MOR 555 was incorrect.
Sorry about that, folks.
That's okay. Should I restate it?
Always perfect timing with the animals.
Okay, alright. Start back from the sort of beginning here.
Okay.
Once that dog calms down.
Yeah.
You can disable the mic while Dr. Carr speaks as well, so it won't input if it's possible at all. Because I just do that anyway, and it just really helps a lot of times in case somebody unexpectedly interrupts or something.
So through my own work, working with other lines of evidence, we found that MOR 555 was miscounted in terms of its growth rings. It had too few growth rings, for its maturity. And since that time, I think Holly has resectioned MOR 555 and has revised the count. So, or found the actual ring count or lines of arrested growth count. So that's been corrected. So histology and the sorts of data that I work with are quite complementary. And overall, they're congruent with each other, which means my hypotheses of maturity does track the chronological age that are recorded in these legs.
That makes sense. A good answer. That agrees with everything I've researched on the matter. So I think this should be a case closed.
One would think.
Yeah, indeed.
But then, we've got people who deny climate change, so
I'll save that for nothing, because I like to keep the political stuff off the show.
Yeah, okay. Sure thing.
Okay, anywho, I might want to take let's see what I got here. Okay. Do you have any theropods do you have any favorite theropod dinosaurs that are not member of the tyrannosauridae family? Just a personal one that Brendan asked.
Well, my favorite dinosaurs tend to be ones with big sample sizes. So, animals like Coelophysis boweri, I find really interesting because there's so much opportunity there to learn so much about its ontogeny, its growth. Same can be said for Centarsus rhodesiensis, Allosaurus fragilis, of course. So really, any dinosaur or extinct animal that has a big sample size with a growth series gets me really excited, because that's a real opportunity to learn about how these animals evolved.
That's a pretty good answer regarding dinosaurs, but is there any interest in paleofauna from, like, say, the Cenozoic era that has a large sample size?
Oh boy, I'm really not that well versed past the Mesozoic, but I'll tell you this. In terms of my own students, at Carthage, I have a paleo track, and the paleo track students do a thesis project. They do a individualized ontogeny project, and certainly I have a lot of students who are interested in dinosaurs. But I really get excited when I have a student who's interested in, say, mammals. So I've had students who have been interested in, elephants and, other proboscideans, so mammoths, mastodons, that kind of thing. And those sorts of animals have a good sample size. I've had us interested in humans and human evolution. And so he did a project on growth in humans using the techniques that I apply to recover growth series. So I really do get excited and interested when I have students who want to work on a group that isn't dinosaurs. It really sort of extends the reach of my own research programs, and it gives a start to theirs.
That ties into a question that ties into something that Dr. Holtz had suggested to discuss with you on the program. He has suggested discussing your ongoing fieldwork with your students out in southeastern Montana and your work in trying to put together a museum at your university.
Yeah, so when I was hired at Carthage, part of the deal was to start a paleo track at the college to train students in the academic side of paleontology, also to get field experience and experience in the lab. So we have a fully equipped and functioning lab at the Carthage Institute of Paleontology. I have students trained in there to prepare dinosaur fossils and other types of fossils, learn how to conserve fossils. I offer an undergraduate field course that's Gen Ed, so any student from any major from the college can take that course and do some field science. And I also view that as the launching point for my paleotrack students. So I really want to get them involved in doing field work and doing field science from day one, practically, from their first summer. And the CIP, as that's short for Carthage Institute of Paleontology, the CIP has a collections, which is a federal repository. We collect on federal lands, and so we have federal repository status. And the lab and collections are in the basement of the Dinosaur Discovery Museum, which is in downtown Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is halfway between Chicago and Milwaukee. It's on the lake. And we feature as far as I know, the largest display of theropod and bird evolution in North America. So we have casts of a whole slew of theropods, from Herrerasaurus to Eoraptor to Spinosaurus, Suchomimus rather, not Spinosaurus, Torvosaurus, Anzu, T-Rex, Sinosauropteryx, and so on. I think we have 21 skeletons on display, which outnumbers all the others. And when I go to other museums, I count. So the number to beat is 21 for a display of bird evolution.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't actually been to that museum. I'm just amazed at how it was able to fit so many different genera in that size of a room that they're set up in, and the specific genera that's in there that you might not see at most other museums, like the aforementioned Suchomimus or Carnotaurus or even Acrocanthosaurus, for example.
Yeah, and most of the poses are custom, so I designed almost all the poses for the mounts. I wanted to show dinosaurs in poses that you normally don't see. So our Allosaurus is lying prone on its hip and its chest. Herrerasaurus is sitting down on its hips and reaching to scratch its tail. Torvosaurus is feeding like a large predatory bird. It's holding its prey down with one foot and turning its head to rip a chunk of prey off while stabilizing itself with its other foot. We have Anzu in an agitated state with its arms raised and kicking out. We have a Dromaeosaurid that's pouncing like a fox, as if it were pouncing on a small prey item, and the Hesperornis is diving. So there's a variety of things to see, hopefully shown in ways that no one's seen before, and the admission is free.
Oh, wow. Is that online anywhere where we could see photos of any of that?
Yeah, there's the DDM, Dinosaur Discovery Museum, does have a web page, and I think people have posted photos online.
Great.
I've also got my own photos from my visits to the museum that you can look at for a first-hand account of what it's like.
Nice. Dr. Carr, you don't teach a strictly dinosaur paleontology class, though, do you?
I do. I teach, so in my paleo track, the main courses are comparative anatomy of the vertebrates, and if students are successful in that, then they can take my dinosaur evolution and extinction course.
Oh, wow.
Of course, there's a field course. They also do an independent study with me where they learn how to do cladistics, and they also start their research project, which is recovering a growth series of, say, a dinosaur or some other extinct species using cladistics, and that gets polished into their senior thesis. And along the way, that project usually gets turned into a poster for SVP. And each time my students have submitted an abstract to SVP, they've landed a poster. And so they get great exposure to potential graduate advisors that way.
That sounds great. I bet they never had anything like that until you showed up at the college, correct?
That's correct.
Wonderful.
Okay, we just got 2 more Facebook questions left here before I'll hand it off to Arson here.
Sure.
Alright. These are one's Jurassic Park related, the other one is just pop culture in general related.
Sure.
Brennan wanted to know about how accurate was T-Rex real life compared to Jurassic Park, and are we really right? And it's something I know you've discussed with Arson in a YouTube video. And my other one is just a matter of preferences. What are your favorite pop culture depictions of tyrannosaurs and other theropods in like movies and television and so forth?
Sure. Well, out of all due respect to everybody involved in Jurassic Park, that's the Jurassic Park T-Rex. That is not what T-Rex looked like at all. Starting with the head, the head doesn't even match the skull. And I guess I'll leave it with that. I don't want to be too rough, but they missed an opportunity to get T-Rex right. However, I will say this about Jurassic Park. Each time I see the movie, I'm always impressed with the first appearance of T-Rex. I don't like the fact that it's screaming its lungs out, but that interior shot of the Rex walking by the Jeep always takes my breath away. Like that, the realism of that, just those few seconds, I always find impressive. So it was worth the price of admission just to see that. I think they got, the overall size, the feel, the emotion, the tension. I think they got it right. In terms of other pop culture depictions of T-Rex, I'm pretty picky. Accuracy matters, and so there honestly aren't many. As I mentioned at the top, I think that the digital Rexes done for the Dueling Dinosaurs BBC documentary, I think, are probably among the best done. And even though it was just too bad that they were part of that documentary, sort of highlighting privately owned dinosaurs, which I don't condone, but those were very well done. There's a model of a Tyrannosaur at the Churchill Museum. It used to be in the library. I think now it's been moved to collections. It was actually done by Philip Curry, and it's an absolutely beautiful Tyrannosaur. And what he got right was the overall look, the proportions, the slenderness of the body, the proportions of the head and legs and tail. And he also accurately captured the fundamental form of a Tyrannosaur head. And I don't know if there are any images of that online. Also, Bob Backer did a series of pencil sketches for the Canadian Museums of Nature, several of which included absolutely gorgeous illustrations of Tyrannosaurs. There's one that comes to mind where it's sort of a three-quarter view from behind of a Tyrannosaur standing in a lake or a river, which is quite striking. And the artwork of Garfield Minot, a Canadian paleo artist who unfortunately isn't widely known. In my view, he produces the most accurate sculptures of Tyrannosaurs, T-Rex in particular. He really does understand the anatomy. He spent time with the cast of the T-Rex skull at the Royal Ontario Museum, and he's just a natural. He basically nails dinosaurs. Doesn't matter what species it is. He always seems to get it right. So that's a few examples of artwork that's caught my eye.
Cool. I mean, as far as dinosaur movies go, letting go of accuracy for a minute, are there any particular dinosaur movies outside Jurassic Park that you just enjoy as a movie buff or a fan of cinema?
What do you think? That's tough. You've stumped me. I will say, okay, when I was a kid, I'll answer it this way. When I was a kid, I saw, I think it was a TV movie. It was called The Last Dinosaur.
Yeah.
And about a bunch of people, they're drilling and they emerge in this prehistoric world somewhere under the earth. And it becomes this, it's kind of like Jaws, it becomes this tale of this battle between one of the explorers and a T-Rex. And it's quite epic. The special effects are atrocious. But as a kid, that sort of really grabbed me in terms of depicting T-Rex as, sort of the rage of nature, as it were.
Richard Boone, is that who starred in that?
Yeah, Richard Boone played the hunter.
Yeah.
Played the hunter
Right.
in the movie. It was a collaboration between Rankin Bass and Subaraya Productions.
Yeah. Oh, I've seen it.
When I was a kid, I was amazed at the Triceratops hiding in the dirt and then charging at the Rex.
Yeah, that scene was pretty funny, just to put it lightly.
Yeah. But remember, this is from an 8-year-old's perspective.
Right.
The T-Rex in that movie sounds suspiciously like Godzilla.
Yep.
Yeah,
As a person in a suit, yes.
Yep, Suitimation heads the Subaraya Productions, the company that Ichi Subaraya, the founding father of Godzilla special effects. Never mind that, of course.
That's right. You're right, though.
But actually, that brings to mind probably one of the best and most serious efforts at depicting dinosaurs was a Canadian Film Board short film about dinosaurs from Alberta that featured a tyrannosaur.
Prehistoric.
I can't remember the title of it. I think that was one of the few serious attempts to get dinosaurs right, sort of as an educational film. And in that tradition, I think another high point for animated dinosaurs was Phil Tippett's short film, snippets of which were shown in the dinosaur documentary hosted by Christopher Reeve, Superman.
Yep.
They showed segments of the Daspletosaurus hunting the Centrosaurus, and that really made a deep impression on me. I mean, it was clear that Phil Tippett cared about getting the dinosaurs accurate, and getting their behavior right, and all the rest of it.
I think that was the Canadian movie. I think was the T-Rex IMAX experience that was in IMAX theaters, I believe.
No, this was back in the 70s or 80s.
Okay.
Yeah, Prehistory Beast, I believe, came out in the 1980s, before the CBS special even came out.
Oh, okay. I'm sure I saw it, but I'm not sure clear what it is. Phil Tippett wanted to make the dinosaurs' tongues shoot out like a snake in Jurassic Park before he was told,
Yeah, good thing Jack was there to...
That's right, Jack told him.
to reel that back, yeah.
There's one thing to thank Jack for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
I read something that said even Jack Horner's coming back on the whole...
I like the wording. Even Jack Horner.
No, he started the whole T-Rex scavenger thing, and even he's kind of coming back saying, I was just wondering if it was a goat or something.
I think he just started it off and then stocked up on popcorn and be like, I'm just gonna chill, guys, you go ahead, like...
I think you're right.
That's what I would do if I were him, so I'm kind of starting to understand where it kind of starts, to piece the puzzle together. Like before I was like, why would he say something like that? And now I realize why it's so much fun, basically trolling.
It got him a lot of attention, not that he needed it. But...
Yeah, it was still funny though, when you think about it that way though. I like that kind of, little thing majiggy going on. In any case, there's I wanted to add to the. I'm sorry, have I interrupted anybody here? Or
well, I was going to mention that there were some other dino films that are usually pretty widely praised. One of them, the movie that Scott Ventura, Valley of Gwanji, indeed any of the stop-motion animated films of Ray Harryhausen, or even the classic 1933 King Kong, a film that has inspired a lot of people to take up paleontology.
Yeah, I remember seeing Gwanji, and that made quite an impression on me when I was quite young, especially when Gwanji's in the church hunting the two kids. that was quite incredible.
Yeah.
But I didn't see King Kong until I was an adult, so it didn't quite have the effect on me that it's had on many others.
Can you remember, has Guanji actually eaten the kids or not? Did they get away?
They get away.
Oh, damn it.
And Guanji fights the elephant, too. You were talking about elephants earlier.
Yeah, and yet the kids always get away. Like, I have a whole rant topic about why why it's pointless to include kid characters in these kind of films, because they always get away and they never ever get eaten. So it kind of makes it boring because it's too predictable. But that's a topic for another time.
And yeah, spoiler alert, Guanji first gets stabbed in the ear by a flagpole, then gets incinerated in the church after it accidentally sets it on fire.
Yeah, I remember that part. I just didn't remember whether or not the kids escaped or not. But I remember that it meets its end in this fire thing. So that's how it kind of went out.
It's actually kind of agonizing to hear the Guanji just screaming in agony that's slowly being burned alive and suffocating in the smoke and smoke and fire.
No, I love it.
And yet the little human kids get away safely.
Nowadays kids don't get off scot-free. So
that's what I'm saying. Yeah, no, they'd probably die.
Yeah.
Brontosaurus or Gorgosaurus? Libratus, Dr. Carr.
Okay. Yeah, we went over this a bit earlier, and since Libratus and Sarcophagus are sister species, which means they share a single common ancestor to the exclusion of all others. I identify that lineage or clade as Albertosaurus. It has two subordinate species, Libratus and Sarcophagus. Therefore, the G word will never pass my lips.
Okay, I thought so. Thank you.
But I'm alone in this, so
yeah,
don't forget that.
Once again, paleontologists that disagree. How unusual.
Welcome to the world of paleontology.
That's right.
Yes, indeed. I mean, that's how science works.
That's right.
Well, if anybody disagrees, everybody is welcome to pick up the books, the data, the pens and papers and start writing. So what's the problem?
They do.
Did you have any questions you would like to ask now, Scott?
You fell asleep.
Yeah. Why would a marine crocodile, Daikasaurus, evolve a head like T-Rex? Isn't that bizarre?
On the one hand, it is. On the other, it isn't. We know that convergent evolution is not unusual. It happens quite frequently. And the question that arises is exactly how do these different unrelated species converge on basically the same type of plan? And that's where the money is, so to speak, in terms of convergent evolution, because it reveals whether or not ant lineages respond to the same sorts of trends, whether or not they achieve that morphology in a similar way. And for that, you need a phylogeny, you need an evolutionary tree, a family tree, you need a pretty good fossil record too, a good sampling of close relatives to really sort of dig into what's going on, what's driving these lineages to converge on the same answer to generally similar problems.
Yeah, but if you think about it, okay, here's a fully aquatic crocodilian with a head like T-Rex. Okay, we know that the Spinosaurs were aquatic. How come they don't have a head like T-Rex?
Well, they just went a different direction, right? They're convergent on crocodilians, and the issue with Daikasaurus is, that it wasn't doing what ancestral crocodilians were doing, or the types of modern crocodiles we're actually familiar with. They aren't ancestral by any means in terms of that lineage.
No.
And so the answer lies in, what do the closest relatives look like? What's the evidence of their diet? Because that similarity to T-Rex might, in the end, turn out to be quite superficial. Maybe, was specialized for...
Most of the other Metriorhynchids have typical crocodilian-looking long snouts and heads.
Well, the funny thing about modern crocs is they aren't very typical at all when you look at crocodilian evolutionary history in its entirety. There's a huge diversity there, and what we tend to think of as familiar crocs are relatively recent, and so there's a lot of diversity there, and Daikasaurus is part of that diversity. And there is a story there to be told in terms of understanding exactly how that lineage came out looking the way it did. That requires more detail in terms of its closest relatives to see how that skull actually evolved.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that was a pretty interesting discussion here. Vacay, if you got any questions left, send them Dr. Carr's way.
We could probably benefit a lot just by perhaps mixing them up a little bit, between you as well, so it's not gonna be me rambling for too long before obviously Dr. Carr responds, because I've got about like 5 or 6 still to go. And even then I had to narrow my list down as much as possible, because a lot of subscribers sent them to me from the channel and stuff like that, and other people, so you're the boss, Greg, so you let me know how it's best to do this one. So shall I just go with one and then we'll pass over to the next person and we'll just take it from there?
I think that could possibly work. If it's a question that I'm already thinking of that you're asking, then I'll let you keep on rambling.
Fair enough. Okay, just let me know whenever you, in the chat or something, when you want to kind of chime in or something, and we'll figure that out. In any case, I've got the question related to the book earlier on about the current project. Me and Dr. Carr have already brought it up several times on the channel, but there is one question. It's actually my own question combined with a few other people too.
Sure.
So will the upcoming book that you're working on right now go through exact same peer reviewing process as the scientific papers? That's the first part. So will it allow basically for people to cite it as a primary source? If the answer is yes, then that takes care of it. If the answer is no, then also will it be accompanied by a set of papers, scientific papers that will be published alongside it as well to kind of complement it? So how will that work out?
The short answer is yes. It will be a peer-reviewed article, a giant article. The prospective viewers are actually dreading when the day comes when they have to review it. But it will be a primary source, and it will become, I hope, well, it's inevitable, it will become a reference for theropod osteology. It covers the entire skeleton, so from the premaxilla to pretty much the end of the tail. And it covers the major growth changes of T-Rex, so it blocks out the growth from juvenile to subadult to adult. Jane is sort of holds down the subadult growth stage for most of the skeleton. So it will be a formal scientific publication, but book length.
So in other words, we're going to have a lot of scientific papers in a big, thick pile, which technically is a definition of a book.
Effectively, yes.
Right. Gotcha. That's amazing. So yeah, guys, do you want to take turn and ask your question, or shall I go with another one as well before somebody chimes in?
I think I might have some. I'd like to maybe do a little paleo art discussion, a little here or something with Dr. Carr here.
Yeah, go for it.
All right. How often are you consulted by paleo artists for reconstructions of paleo art, and in particular to tyrannosaurs? And to go along with that, are there any paleo artists or works of paleo art that you are particularly fond of, be it past or present?
Mm-hmm. I'm actually not consulted that frequently at all. It's it might happen once every 6 months. That's a pretty high rate. I think many paleo artists nowadays are pretty confident in their knowledge. There's certainly a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of people to ask. But no, I'm not consulted with any particular frequency. Even after the publication of Horneri, there really hasn't been any bump in being consulted. In terms of artwork of tyrannosaurs, I'm really picky. So, as I mentioned earlier, the one-off sculpture that Philip Curry did of a tyrannosaur, which is at Tyrrell Museum, is really excellent. The artist Vladimir Kurb did a series of bas-relief sculptures for the field station at Dinosaur Provincial Park, just north of Brooks, Alberta. Unfortunately, that's been taken down, but what he did was a bunch of bas-relief sculptures of all 35 dinosaurs found in the park, including tyrannosaurs, and that was always a very powerful piece of artwork that I would actually like to emulate myself. I do admire the artwork of Greg Paul. I think he's the first true innovator, along with Bob Backer. I think Bob was one of the first people, along with Greg, to bring real scientific rigor to illustrations of dinosaurs, and also sort of to fill this out. I think Doug Henderson is an incredible artist. He really does capture dinosaurs accurately, and also captures, obviously, the environment as well in a very striking and powerful way. I also like the fact that Doug Henderson works in different media. I mean, the color pastel work is absolutely astonishingly beautiful. He also works in
Uh-oh, looks like we've lost him for a second.
he doesn't. Oh. Yeah, have we lost somebody?
Hi, we had lost you for a sec. You were talking about Doug Henderson.
Okay, should I just pick up?
I suppose you could pick back up to where you were first discussing about Doug Henderson.
Okay.
I would like to, before you my goodbyes first, because I gotta go and get something to eat now, guys.
Sure. It was a pleasure to chat with you.
Very much. Yeah, I'm sorry to go, but I really need to get some dinner.
Understood.
Yes, very understood.
Enjoy your meal, Sam. You know, like all the best places and crews always have their Sam, like Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, so it was nice to have you here as well as part of the crew here.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye, Sam.
Yeah, again,
Take care, mate.
I hope I'm not disappointing anybody that I gotta...
No,
Nah.
you got your questions answered. That's plenty good enough, I think.
Just feel for everyone.
We're not robots, unfortunately.
Yeah, we have to eat, sleep, and go to work. All that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Bring me back.
And a cup of ale for me, please.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, guys. See you later.
See ya.
Yeah.
Oh, anyhow, back on topic here.
Okay, I'll make it brief. I also admire the work of Doug Henderson. He gets the dinosaurs right, the environment's right. His original lithographs in the River Dinosaur really was where I first saw his work. And then after that was Maya, the story of a dinosaur, or how a dinosaur grows up. So I see Doug, Bob, and Greg as sort of the nucleus of modern dinosaur art. And so they're the standard against which I compare all the others that have come since. And also, actually, I'll just add Mark Hallett is also part of that inaugural group of modern paleo art, particularly for dinosaurs. So they're the standard for me.
No doubt about it.
And if we had to go way back before that, Charles Knight would be the gold standard for the old style reconstructions.
Yep, definitely. He's done some very powerful work. So yeah, looking way back, Charles Knight is there too.
Along with the likes of Zdenek Burian and Ellie Kish.
Yes, yep, I agree. In terms of the old school, Burian, definitely. I had and still have his book, The Life Before Man. Very striking artwork, very original. And yeah, Ellie Kish as well is one of the original of the modern group as well. yeah, can't leave her out either.
We do a lot of burying in the magazine. I gotta get your address, Dr. Carr, and start sending you the magazine. Maybe I can even talk you into an interview too, and email the interview or something later on.
Yeah.
So.
You can talk me into it.
All right, twist your arm.
Arm is twisted.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Who I'd also like to get your opinion about the current state of dinosaur documentaries. It seems that a problem that I've come across with documentaries nowadays is the use of sensationalism, inaccuracies, making stuff up, misquoting paleontologists, and some other rather shady business practices that have been outlined to us by some of our previous guests, like Dinosaur George Blossing on Fight Club, and even Dr. Holtz mentioned some of the issues that went on during the Philosopher documentaries that didn't reveal their true position or statement on X or Y. I wonder if you had any such problems on documentaries you've been on, and if you had the chance to make dinosaur documentaries, what steps would you take to make sure that they don't repeat the mistakes of documentaries of the past?
Sure. Well, the first aspect is that one major problem that I see is that privately owned tyrannosaur fossils have been featured front and center in documentaries. So, for example, a few years ago, there was a documentary on the dueling dinosaurs, in particular the Tyrannosaur, where they argued it was Nanotyrannus, and that's a privately owned specimen. And I was actually invited to be a talking head on that, and I refused. I said, as long as you're including a privately owned specimen, I'm not going to be in this documentary, because my presence would just validate the ownership of that fossil. And I suggested that if they wanted to feature the growth changes in T-Rex, then they could just easily shoot in LA, where they have a juvenile, subadult, and adult T-Rex. But of course, we know that never happened. And also recently with documentary The Real T-Rex with Chris Packham, the centerpiece specimen there is a T-Rex adult, a skeleton nicknamed Tristan, which is also privately owned. And I was not invited to do an on-camera interview for that. I did do an initial discussion about scales, but at the time I didn't know that Tristan was featured in it. Had I known that, I wouldn't have participated at all. So I think that's an issue that documentarians seem to not pay attention to the ethics and the uncomfortable position that featuring a privately owned fossil puts a scientist in. And so I think that's an issue. I agree with you regarding the other problems, is documentaries tend to be superficial and all the rest of it. So I think the solution is that us scientists actually take control. That documentarians have to listen to scientists, that they have to realize that scientists actually provide the narrative, they actually know their field. The documentarians shouldn't impose their own narrative on scientific content, especially if the documentary is about a scientific matter. The scientists should guide the narrative. We produced a small documentary on Dyspleosaurus horneri to coincide with the publication, and in that case, I worked with a small group of students, and I had full control over the narrative. There was an understanding of what I bring to the table and what they bring to the table, and I think it worked out quite well. That video can be seen on YouTube, I think, on the college's YouTube channel. So I also think that us paleontologists actually have to take a stand when it comes to documentaries. We have to ask questions like, are there any privately owned specimens in this documentary, and explaining why that's problematic for us. And also I think we have to be forthright in terms of content. If a documentarian wants to take a particular slant on a story, that's inaccurate or misinformed, then we've got to call them out on it, not in a rude fashion, but in a way that serves as a course correction. So I agree that there's currently an issue, there's multiple issues, and as scientists we just have to have the confidence to assert ourselves for the best, in the interest of the best possible outcome for the product that the documentarians are making.
If I could, I don't know if this is a necessary clarification, but for non-dinosaur people, they might not understand what you're saying, that when the fossils go to private owners, science doesn't get a chance to examine the pieces.
Yeah, part of the ethics of vertebrate paleontology is that you do not study privately owned specimens, that we only study specimens that are in legitimate museum collections or university or college collections. The reason for that is simply reproducibility of observations. Public trusts, like say the Field Museum or the American Museum or Dinosaur Discovery Museum for that matter, are public trusts, which means that fossil collection will be in that museum for as long as civilization is around. That's a guarantee that other scientists can check the observations made by other scientists. There's no such guarantee with a fossil that's owned by a private individual. So there may be, there's no guarantee that the fossil will be in a person's home after they die. There's no guarantee that the fossil won't be sold. There's no guarantee that, there's no guarantee of anything. And if a science is to have any integrity, you have to have a stable baseline of information that is secure from the vagaries or the whimsies of individual people.
I'm sorry, I thought you were finished, but it's like famous artwork, when it's in someone's home, we're not enjoying it,
Yeah.
But there was an article in Smithsonian last year that was on the kind of a different side of the coin. These people have dug up, I think it's an ankylosaur and a dromaeosaur that might even be new to science, but since they didn't do it with a paleontologist, no one studied it. So it's just kind of sitting there, and that's a shame too.
Yeah, it is. For T-Rex, the situation is pretty desperate. In my data set, I have around 30 Rexes, but there's at least a dozen more that are in private hands, and since they are not in real museum collections, I can't study them.
I didn't realize that. Wow.
And to make matters worse is that a good number of those specimens are actually quite young animals that fill in gaps, major gaps, in our current understanding of the growth series of T-Rex. And we'll never know what those specimens actually bring to the table because they're privately owned.
No,
so science really hurts. Science is really hurt by private ownership of fossils. Sorry to interrupt.
If a private owner brought the fossil to you, would you look at it? I mean,
no.
No, yeah, I thought.
Not at all. The standard of the science is that the fossils we study must be accessioned into a legitimate public trust.
Gotcha.
And it doesn't matter if someone, brought me, say, the dueling tyrannosaur and dropped it in my lap. I'm just going to walk away from it unless it's in a real museum. Because otherwise there's no other way that anyone can confirm my observations if it just disappears into private ownership after that.
How do you feel about the Tucson Rock and Fossil Show?
Yeah, a lot of fossils show up there.
Yeah.
And it's a shame.
Mike, I wanted to address your question as well because this is basically, there's a video that I've produced on the channel where we discuss the ethics. So if I drop you the link later on after that, you can also not only obviously enjoy the video and the discussion, but there's a lot of...
I would love to see it.
Yeah, there's like an article links, there's like lots of links as a supplementary in the description and stuff. In fact, actually, if you Google, if you search for one of my posts in the Prehistoric Times group, you will be able to find that I've shared it there, but I will drop it to you anyway because it must have been buried quite far away, so I don't want to trouble you with that. In any case, I'll drop it to you later and give you a good read for that if you're interested. So, yeah, I wanted to ask if it's okay to also address the topic, because I kind of want to transition into the whole idea of the studying specimens subject, if that's okay with you, Greg, as well.
Oh, go right ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, dog. Yeah. Dog said hi. Okay, fine. I suppose. In any case, so say for example, if there is a situation where you have, like, say, a specimen in a museum collection, and let's say it becomes, like, it gets destroyed as a result of maybe, you know, casualty of poaching, theft, or war, whatever could happen that makes the specimen basically disappear from the face of the earth. Mm-hmm. Will this mean that the data set that has been collected from this specimen and published still be valid, or will it require, you know, a lot of backtracking and data recollection in order to retrace it from other specimens that are still around in order to fulfill the requirement of being able to replicate the test and observation? Or does that still, saved as, you know, preserved as the knowledge? How would basically one handle this situation if that were to happen? Of course, hope not, but let's say it does. How would we go about that?
It has happened, and one thing to keep in mind is that scientific knowledge, at the end of the day, is located in the scientific literature. And so this has happened, a loss of a specimen. For example, Spinosaurus, the type specimen, was destroyed. And so in practice, what that means is that paleontologists have had no recourse but the literature to consult when dealing with that animal, you know, in their own research. So the original articles by Stromer, a number of years ago, a team published photographs of the specimen when it was mounted in Berlin, and now that's part of the scientific literature as well, so people can draw information from that. So in the event of the loss of a specimen, pardon me, our only recourse is this published literature or casts, if any are available, in any other museum collection.
Bear with us, folks.
Pardon
that's
me.
all right. I've it just reminded me to reach out for a drink, and I realized that my tea is finished as well.
Hope you're feeling better.
Okay, I'm back.
You okay?
Yep. Yep. So it's short answer is, if a specimen's lost, you better hope there's a cast and that somebody's described it in the literature. Otherwise, gone is gone.
So this is basically one of those things that was a problem, because one of the questions as well that I had, just a quick one from a guy who you all guys probably know, an artist named Chris Schrinka. I hope I'm not butchering the name as well.
Christopher Schrinka, I think is how you call
Schrinka, yeah, that's right, yeah. Well, I just call him Chris because we talk all the time, so we're like buddies essentially. So, but everybody knows who we're talking about here. So yeah, he asked as well about, this is basically fitting this scenario that we've just been touched over about the Tarbosaurus mummy in Mongolia. When it got poached, it basically got destroyed, and there were only it's a very limited data set that was recovered from it. He had a question whether there is actually any evidence of a throat pouch or a quote-unquote dewlap, and whether or not you had a chance to actually see it or examine it, whenever you're ready to answer that.
Yeah, that's a most unfortunate situation for many reasons. So the short story, as I understand it, was Batar was found with skin impression, and one team found it and started collecting it, like exposing it for collection, and then some other group sort of took over. It was a political thing, and apparently was destroyed upon collection. And there are a few photographs of it that have surfaced, but in the popular literature, like magazines and that sort of thing, it's never made its way into the scientific literature, because there basically isn't a specimen anymore. There's just a couple photographs. So scientifically, it's a complete loss, and and so it's not, this may sound paradoxical, but it isn't even on the table in terms of considering it as part of the body of evidence for scaly tyrannosaurs, because the specimen is gone, it's been destroyed, and the question can always be raised, what do those photographs show really at the end of the day? So it's a very sad tale, and I don't think it's a specimen that anyone can hang their hat on in terms of any knowledge claim, since all there are a couple photographs.
So obviously the photographs. Yeah. So the photographs don't actually obviously give us a conclusion, because they could mean literally anything, and we already know there's always going to be somebody out there who will find variety of ways to interpret what they see, and without being able to, without being able to have a peer review process done. That means we cannot avoid the bias, and without avoiding the bias, then we cannot be safe. Sad situation.
And also, photographs aren't the specimen.
Right? That's true. Yeah, that's true.
So you need the specimen, and to do rigorous science has to be based on specimens, not photographs of things. And so that's important. That protects the integrity of the science. And it's certainly, a loss of a specimen like that is regrettable. But I'm optimistic that specimens like that will be found in the future. There can't only be one. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, same here. I think everybody here hopes for something like that to come up. I mean, let's hope that it's not going to be like the Highlander. There can be only one. Let's just say there should be many. We want many of them. So, is it okay to, while I'm at it, ask, let's just say the last quote-unquote serious question before anybody else chimes in, and then a few kind of light-hearted ones towards the end, perhaps, whenever Greg decides to conclude the session. Would that be all right to quickly ask a serious question now, Greg?
Yeah, go right ahead. If you got one serious one, this
is the last serious one. This is the last serious one, I promise you. Don't worry, okay. I'm not going to overburden you guys with this. So that's also asked by Chris, and this is the one here about stand specimen. So it says that it's been observed with very elongated teeth protruding, and that it's also observed in other tyrannosaurs, and there's, in stand in particular, there's supposedly, if that's confirmed, of course, whether or not, please, if it's correct or not, but that it has that it bore holes into the palate of the skull as well. And what are your thoughts on why these teeth could so unusually long, and is it something that is common to see throughout your experience, direct or indirect, with the specimen tyrannosaurs as well, whether already published and studied or currently in progress, or is this quite a rare and unusual sort of event? What are your comments and obviously your response to that question?
Yeah, the teeth, that's not the natural condition. Like every other archosaur in life, it's only the enamel-covered part of the tooth that's exposed along the tooth row. And sort of there's this process, by the process of tooth replacement, mature tooth is lost without exposing much of the root. Most of the root is gone by the time the next tooth is coming in. So that's just, those really long teeth, that's just fiction. And that's the long and short of it.
Fair enough. Thank you very much.
I had my serious face on, too.
What is that, sorry?
I was wearing my serious face to answer the serious question.
Yeah. I know everybody
we all
was
feel pressured to be funny. Now we're pressured.
Yeah, I mean, guys, feel free to chime in and we can move on to the funny stuff if you've also run out of serious stuff.
I've seen a cast of the Stan's skull before, and I don't remember extremely large teeth. I mean, T-Rex has extremely large teeth, but I guess I missed that.
Yeah, the thing to look for is that most of the root is exposed, so when they put the teeth in, it's not down to the crown. They leave most of the root exposed, and not just some teeth.
I see. Yeah,
wasn't the case.
Yeah, it's kind of easy to actually tell. I think there is quite a distinction between the texture when, like, you would probably where you would expect to find gums starting, and then it would kind of be the exposed crown, and then it would go all the way deep. Yeah. This also brings, an important point of observation of how massive and stocky the roots of the T-Rex teeth are, which makes them pretty ridiculously probably strong and scary to think of if you were to end up in these jaws, perpendicular.
I agree.
It wouldn't hurt for long.
It would be like a very quick but a very strong one.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dog testifies that it's probably correct.
Yes.
Yeah, that brings me into the T-Rex's bite force. I've seen several different estimates for how powerful the bite force of Tyrannosaurus Rex has been, from like 3,000, 6,000 psi up to like 12,800 psi. Which of these figures, or any figures unlisted, would be the most accurate estimate for the bite strength of Tyrannosaurus Rex?
Yeah, that's a question for the guys that actually do this, and I don't mean to be sexist in saying guys. I think it's Mason Mears and Greg Erickson are a couple of the main people who have worked on that. So in my view, those results represent a range. There's different ways of arriving at those estimates, and it's not clear, at least to me, if they're mutually exclusive or not. But I think a more reliable person to ask would be someone like Greg Erickson. So I'm going to punt on that one.
Hasn't he found coprolites with a lot of crushed bones in them attributed to you?
Yep, there's one coprolite from Saskatchewan that has pulverized bone in it, probably from an Edmontosaurus. And that says something about bite forces, which is consistent with his work on, which was based on gouges in Triceratops bones.
That is where we have our direct evidence of true predation from a Tyrannosaurus Rex that more or less put the nail in the old scavenger hypothesis that Horner had proposed all those years ago.
Well, I would argue that it's evidence for biting and the bite force. It's not evidence for hunting or scavenging. It's evidence that the bite forces of T-Rex were high enough to penetrate the very dense cortical bone of large ornithischians. And it's also evidence that for the puncture pull style of bite that Greg described. But arguably it is neutral on hunting and scavenging, because you can bite something alive and you can bite something that's dead.
Yeah. Now, on the actual predation, they actually have found hadrosaurs and other herbivores that actually had evidence of healed bite marks that were made from a Tyrannosaurus that had tried to kill it but had failed in doing so.
Failed.
Is that the Edmontosaurus with the bitten, so-called bitten spinous processes of the tail?
Yeah, I think that was one of the specimens. Was a hadrosaur like that.
So the arguably anything could have that lesion. So the trimmed spinous processes, we weren't there to see the event. There's actually no direct evidence that a T-Rex took a bite out of the tail. So we really don't know. I think the only argument is that the missing spinous processes look like they follow an arc, and in the imagination you could, put a T-Rex snout there. It has a roughly arc-like shape too, but you really don't know what caused that lesion. It could have been an injury elsewhere on the body, surprisingly enough. So I think that if we're going to make the knowledge claim that T-Rex actually bit something that lived, you actually have to have a tooth embedded in a healed bone to actually make the claim. Because animals can injure themselves in many ways. So we have to have a high standard of evidence.
That's what they often do on TV. They'll take a cast of a T-Rex tooth and they'll put it in the hole and say, "See, it fits." And I've always wondered about that. As much as I want it to be true that he's a hunter, I've always wondered about that accuracy.
Well, it's the details that count. Sometimes those puncture marks, you can put in some casting compound and basically pull out the shape of a tooth, the conical shape, the cross section, and even the carinae will leave a mark. The carinae are the knife-like ridges on the front and back edges of a tooth. Sometimes a transfer tooth will scrape across cortical bone and leave parallel grooves left by the denticles. I mean, that's a smoking gun. What's a smoking gun for a bite? There's no reason to extrapolate that to hunting. So tooth marks and such and denticle scrapes are evidence of a bite, but you really have to have a high standard of evidence to suggest that it's evidence of hunting. And what that standard would be, I don't know.
While we were talking, I did find a paper that answered just that question from Barbara De Palma, Dave Burnham, Larry Martin, Bruce Rothschild, and Peter L. Larson, titled "Physical Evidence of Predatory Behavior in Tyrannosaurus rex." The abstract reads thusly: feeding strategies of the large theropod Tyrannosaurus rex, either as a predator or a scavenger, have been a topic of debate previously compromised by lack of definitive physical evidence. Tooth drag and bone puncture marks have been documented on suggested prey items, but are often difficult to attribute to a specific theropod. Further, post-mortem damage cannot be distinguished from intravital occurrences unless evidence of healing is present. Here we report definitive evidence of predation by T-Rex, a tooth crown embedded in a hadrosaurid caudal centrum surrounded by healed bone growth. This indicates that the prey escaped.
Okay, but keep this in mind, is that, okay, we've got a fragment of tooth in the vertebra that has healed. All that is evidence of is a bite that left a fragment of tooth in a vertebra. We weren't there to see the event happen. We don't know the context of how that bite came about. Why does it have to be predation? Could have one dinosaur stepped on another's foot? You really don't know the actual event. That's long gone. That's over 66 million years gone. So what we have evidence of is just a bite and nothing else.
It's just one of those things that basically, I think it's the same goes for the scavenging. Like, you can't really make any definitive claim on both the scavenging or predation just based on that. It just means that they've been bitten, but, well, they've been bitten. We have proof of bite, right? So, otherwise, I don't see how that proves predation. As much as I'm in favor of the idea that they were not exclusive scavengers, but they were just balanced as any other predator anyway would be, but I just don't see that obviously as a sufficient enough proof to put the nail in the coffin, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'm saying that as someone who, I think the null hypothesis is that T-Rex was a hunter, but I don't see how that is evidence of anything more than a bite. And we don't know the context of that bite. Animals bite when they're alarmed. Animals bite when they're hurt. There's many reasons to bite. And so I think the standard of evidence for this has to be quite high. And we have to be mindful of alternate hypotheses. they're equally likely. And I think that that article doesn't bring much more to the table other than emphasizing that point, that we don't have cause. And that's a step beyond the evidence is cause.
It's kind of wandering into the more speculation territory, which is something that, well, as fun as it may be to do over a cup of coffee or a tea, it's just not something that we can work with, I guess. Well, you can work with being the scientist. I'm just saying we, as in, like, you know,
Yes.
people who read and try to do research and stuff as well. So, what would be your response to a question like, say, you know, when people make claims that they could totally outrun a T-Rex? Like, what's your thought on that part?
Well, there are estimates for how quickly T-Rex could walk, and that's comes from the work of the fantastic work of John Hutchinson. And it's possible, if my memory serves, it's almost certainly possible a person could outrun a walking T-Rex. They'd have to be moving pretty quickly. Speed is affected by size. So, for example, a small dog has to run or trot to catch up with a walking human being, and a walking human being has to walk or jog at a pretty brisk pace to keep up with an elephant. So we'd see those same scaling effects with large dinosaurs, especially T-Rex, since it has fairly long feet and shins, relatively speaking. But it's not beyond possibility that people could outrun a charging adult T-Rex, because they intrinsically can't run or they risk breaking their own legs. So there is a cap, but the exact numbers escape me at the moment.
Sure. So would that be also possible to do in an open field, or are we talking about maybe if a human was able to outrun it long enough to get to the safety of the dense foliage?
I think in both scenarios, a person had better be moving quickly.
Fair enough. So that's just a part of the research as well, to to think of for those who probably want to do anything like maybe story or book writing, stuff like that, like I do, for example. And Sean, before he left us, he's also working on a project. So that's a thing to consider when you are going to be guys doing, any kind of stories related to humans with dinosaurs and how likely they could run away from things like T-Rex and etc.
I would add to that that artists and writers consult the scientific literature. There's many of these questions are answered. These estimates of speed, they are out there, they are published, and so none of that information is kept secret at all. It is in the scientific literature.
Well, this is basically going back to the to one of the advices that we have listed earlier on in the session, which is one word of advice: read.
Yeah.
Once again, we came back full circle to reading. Basically, seems like reading is the mother of all things here.
Yes.
And what are your thoughts about the studies? Like, have there been any good studies that we can maybe give the listeners the citation for? As far as the vision goes, how well could the tyrannosaurids and maybe T-Rex in particular see? Is there any specific material we can look for to have a go crack on, or is it still in progress, or do we not actually have any actual published data sets on this yet?
There's at least one article by Kent Stevens, and I think it's published in the Tyrant King book produced by Indiana University Press. It's a multi-authored edited volume on T-Rex, and I think Kent has vision stuff on theropods in there. In addition to that, I would just do a search online for research by Kent Stevens. So on his dinosaur vision work, I think there's at least one article that he's done on this area. He's done a lot with mobility of vertebrae in sauropods. That's been one of his major foci of his dinosaur research. But there's at least one article on vision in T-Rex and other theropods, primarily dealing with the overlap of right and left visual fields and depth perception, that sort of thing.
Awesome sauce. So yeah, that definitely is something to look for as well, to get a better understanding of how they would see. Well, my last question, so at the moment, like literally, is and that's me basically ticking everything in a list that I've brought here to the table. Is what do you probably you've heard that Dr. Lawrence Whitmer, for everyone else known as Larry Whitmer from Whitmer Lab, he's currently, I believe, in a possession and in the progress of studying the skull of Sioux specimen. So there's been a few interesting posts from there and then that we get to see, like the process of the work, although I don't believe it has yet been finalized and published. But what do you hope would be something that we would expect to see as a result of this study? Do you think this could potentially give us some more secrets that we haven't been aware of, that been right in front of our eyes there? Or would it perhaps maybe just reiterate and confirm and further validate some of the already established hypotheses related to Tyrannosaurus and the particular?
I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know anything about this project that Larry's working on.
Gotcha.
Hopefully it's, I know he's done some endocranial stuff based on the CT images published by Chris Brussatte back in 2003, but I don't know a thing about his recent work, so I'm not in the loop on that. Larry does fantastic detailed work. He's an extraordinary anatomist. He innovated the extant phylogenetic bracket, which basically forms the foundations of the sorts of inferences of soft tissues that we make in dinosaurs and other extinct animals. So I know that whatever Larry does, it's going to be, another standard-setting piece of work.
Yeah, the 2001 study on nostrils is still kind of being frequently cited, and that's been like years and years after it's been first published, and I believe there hasn't been any kind of further revision of it, or not that I know of, but this thing, as it is, that paper itself is still like frequently cited nowadays. Too bad it's frequently overlooked though by others, but it's a very good material to go back to, because I remember we discussed that when we were doing our creature review on the Jurassic Park T-Rex, and how the reconstruction of the nostrils was done, was not done properly, that is. Yep. So that was one of our main sources to go to. I believe, is it Whitmer et al. 2001? Or is it a different title? I can't remember the full title of this.
Yeah,
I know what it is,
but I can't either. But it's a classic work, and it's easy to find online.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it won't be difficult. So, guys, I'm still going to stick around in case something else comes up, but do you want to chime in and see what else we can discuss, unless this concludes the session, Gregory?
I don't know if I've got much else to discuss, but I actually have the paper in question describing the predatory behavior of Tyrannosaurus here in full. It actually shows the evidence I was going to mention, that an actual rex tooth that was broken off, that was stuck in the caudal centrum of this hadrosaur, that was surrounded by healed bone growth.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually shows how they came to the conclusions, and even shows the actual tooth stuck in the tailbone.
Yep. Yep, they do.
Yep, that's what I was referencing earlier. An actual tooth that broke out of Rex's mouth, got stuck in the tail end of a hadrosaur, and actually got infected, and new bone growth eventually formed around it.
So it's one of those cases when they try to bite, well, hypothetically speaking, basically, because we don't really know, because we haven't been there to hold the candle to it, but like it bit it, and then the tooth got stuck, and then like basically it's like got all infected, and well, proves that it escaped basically alive with the tooth in it.
The hadrosaur managed to get away and survive sometime after the injury.
Is there any evidence of compression fractures on T-Rex teeth, like you find on meg teeth sometimes?
Yeah, what they'll do is one of two things will happen is they'll either spall off a very thin flake from one side of the tooth or the other, either the labial or lingual side. Tyrannosaurs also wear the enamel down, so you'll have, like, the denticles are on these ridges that cross the top of the tooth, and often those will be worn down right through to the dentine in fairly mature teeth. So those are the two primary types of damage that are seen on teeth. In some big adults, they will basically flake off most of their tooth. So you get this faceted, stump-like remains of a tooth in their jaws that will ultimately be shed. But yeah, they damage their teeth through two modes: brute force, biting into bone, and also just by continuous wear and tear.
Yep, that's common with just about any theropod in general, not just a T-Rex. Teeth get messed up through either trying to bite through bone or through getting in a struggle with something that's fighting back, or old age even.
Old age for the individual tooth.
I think he just had a dog there barking, saying that it, trying to be heard out, that it also likes to bite bones, but nobody seems to care.
The T-Rex is laying on the ground. He's sick or hurt or sleeping, unaware of his surroundings, and a whole herd of hadrosaurs come along, and one gets pushed into him, and he rears back and takes a bite out of him, and all he gets is a little bit of his tail, and the hadrosaur runs away. The end.
I think that's definitely possible because you know how, Dr. Carr earlier on said that there's many reasons to bite, and I think pissing someone off is a good reason enough to bite if that's all the weapon you have to respond with, so why not?
That's another thing to keep in mind is that with these sorts of things, it's very easy to imagine anything happening. But we always have to check that against the evidence we actually have. And so I tell my students that we really have to keep a leash on the inferences we make. We have to stay as close to the actual evidence at hand that we can. And that's not an easy thing to do, because it is very easy for us to imagine any manner of scenario that suits our fancy. It's so very hard to let go of our own biases, and it's also hard to not let our own imaginations persuade us that a certain conclusion must be true, when in the meantime the evidence just simply doesn't even go that far. And I think that's the case for, these bite marks or teeth embedded in bones. We really have to have a reality check on the inferences that we make.
Was that you basically referencing the quote you made on my channel from Francis Bacon about how to assess the evidence?
Yes.
I always like to bring up that quote every now and then when I talk about it in my group. It's a very good one. It's a very simple one, but it's also very useful. And I remember when I first... to those who don't know, who are unfamiliar, when me and Dr. Carr did an interview, that was, sounds very weird saying this, but back in 17, in November, because 17 was just like yesterday, but back in 17, in November, when we did an interview, just after we had a chat, I got so quote-unquote infected with the idea to always approach more kind of, be a bit more strict, with the empirical evidence, that whenever I see a discussion going and people just derail the discussions or debates without not only establishing the grounds in the first place, but also just completely derailing it into a completely different territory, I just almost facepalm myself to death. Just took me time to get used to seeing that around. I think now I'm used to it now, so... ever anybody else out there, welcome to the club.
I don't know. Do you think we should probably start to wrap things up here, or do you think we have a little few more things we could possibly discuss here?
I'm finished, Dr. Carr. I thank you so much for your patience. This lasted, as they always do, a lot longer than we thought they would, because we love the subject, as you can tell.
Yep, same here. And just
I'll get your email from Greg, and I'll contact you if that's okay.
that'll be great. That's okay. Just thanks for including me on this.
Our pleasure.
Shall we maybe do like a quick sort of nice goodbye, but reminder to the listeners of why dinosaurs are super mega awesome?
Yeah, you could basically say that since you're a guest star, and since this is going up on my channel here in good time.
You say it.
So do I get to say why dinosaurs are awesome?
Go ahead.
Okay, but Dr. Carr is the one who should probably
Well,
validate the. Yeah, well, we'll both do it. Okay, on account of 1, 2. Okay, I go first.
Go ahead.
So yeah, I cheated there a little bit. Sorry. Yeah, I think dinosaurs are awesome just because, well, you know, they're awesome, but because they just give us a lot of knowledge and understanding of the history. They give us an idea of just the time scale, you know, of how long us humans, for example, been around, and how quickly we seem to push things, quote unquote, forward, whatever that means nowadays, and compared to how like lengthy and perhaps probably hardly noticeable those evolutionary and different paths and processes were back when dinosaurs were around, because we only see it. Like you will probably notice this, all of you guys here, when you look at the screen, right? You look at the diagram of, like, say, Cretaceous period, Jurassic period, etc. Then it's broken down into smaller fragments, for example, and we kind of get really tempted easily to look at it as if they're just like small centimeter whatever gaps on a diagram, but that gap represents maybe, like, I don't know, 10 million times the time we have been around as human beings. And I think that's one of those things that are just really awesome about dinosaurs, that not only they remind us of how quote-unquote puny we are, both pun intended, because a lot of them are literally making us puny next to them, but also because of the time scale of how long they've been around and what they've been through as well in terms of their different, you know, the changes that they've been through. So there's that point. And the other point why they're awesome is because they teach us a lot about nature, I guess, and what natural selection does and used to do and still does to a degree. And we are just lucky ones to be able to trace it back, thanks to them. I think I will be quiet now, I suppose, and let Dr. Carr finish off with why dinosaurs are awesome.
That okay, Greg?
Yeah, let's go ahead, Doc. If you got something to say as to why dinosaurs are the coolest thing since sliced bread, go right on ahead.
Dinosaurs are the coolest thing since sliced... Blah. Dinosaurs are the coolest thing since sliced... Oh, try it again.
Start again.
Third one is a charmer.
Dinosaurs are the coolest thing since sliced bread because they put us in our place.
I think. Well,
that's the mic drop basically, and just walk out of the room essentially, like, you know, like
That's
yeah,
right.
they put us in our
Drop
place.
the
That's it.
microphone, walk out of the
Yeah,
room.
exactly. Just drop the mic,
Mic
that
drop.
really tapping sound.
mic drop. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks again, really, because what a treat this has been for me, I'll tell you.
I say it's
been
a
a lot
treat
of
for
fun.
me as well. I loved it. I mean, thanks, Greg, so much for also inviting me as a
you, Greg.
guest too.
Yeah.
And it's always a pleasure to talk to Dr. Carr as well, because we've already done a couple sessions. We always enjoy it, so that would be awesome to do more. And we need to do more often these kind of, you know, sit down in circle type of conversations.
All right. All right.
Yep, it's always my pleasure to have you on, Mike, and it was a pleasure to have you on for the first time, AK Rex. And of course, Dr. Carr, you're always welcome to come back on the show if you have any new discoveries you would like to share with us.
Well, thank you for having me, and I will keep you in the loop.
We'll get you on to ask questions of somebody else sometime. How would that?
We're waiting for that, pre-order button to show up for that fake book that's coming up.
Why, yes, that new book.
Yeah. Be sure and send Prehistory Times a review copy.
Most definitely.
Speaking of review copies, Mike, I still owe you my own, but I've sold out, unfortunately, so I'll have to make a new batch and send you one. That's a different kind of copy, but you know which one I'm talking about.
A second printing is fine.
Yeah.
All right, good night, everybody. I really enjoyed it.
Likewise.
Good night,
All
Mike.
right.
Mike out.
Okay, here, I'll sign us off here. Okay, once again, ladies and gents, this has been Prehistory Traveler's Guide. I'm your host, Greg Nunn, and this was one of our better episodes. Stay tuned for next Saturday, March 3rd, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, as I interview one of my good friends from the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, Ashley Hall, on paleontology education, and this will be the inaugural episode of what I'm calling the Women of Paleontology series for my podcast. Have a good night, and good luck, everyone. Signing out.